The girl who'd just started whining about being hungry flung her arms wide, and out of the ground, a gigantic plant monster erupted behind her, roaring with a mouth so huge it could swallow the whole forest. Akihinas kept tumbling, barely slipping past those teeth, because under that helpless child act, something predatory was stalking her. The monster, perched on a heavy vine, leaned in and warned the fool not to fight because even his own relatives had already written him off as a nobody, trapped to die in this forest. Vines tightened around the boy's body, and when panic should have hit, a predator's grin snapped onto his face. To claim the right to devour others, he shoved it in her face and made it clear it didn't just belong to her. With a single savage snap, Aki drove his teeth into the living vine and ripped off a chunk of flesh from the monster. A system window exploded across his vision, Plant Eater, and the stats shot upward in seconds, the exact same power that had just days ago gotten his biological father to throw him out of the house. The heavy parental boot slammed down and crushed the dry leaf on the floor, while Akiginas knelt at the head of the family and, once again, called his firstborn a worthless disappointment. The old man stared down at him with pure contempt, then, right in the end, declared his eldest son the family's disgrace. The family head shot a cruel look at his firstborn's miracle and sneered, "Plant Eater," because he could finally devour any plant at all and stop there, while every single Gina had rare gifts of their own. Fire and ice, blazing in the younger brother's hands, only proved every last word to be true. Aki clenched his teeth, totally trapped in helplessness. The family head kept up his cruel, mocking lament, dissing how his son got stuck with a weak inheritance from some low-born woman. "Mom was right there," the boy screamed, bursting under the torment, and with his rage flaring, the wall behind him split with a thunderous crack. The father didn't budge, just stared and coldly declared, "The Gina's house got a serious order from the royal capital, so nobody's keeping extra things here anymore." The boy went utterly numb with shock. Right at the edge of a brand new life, that strange tail-wearing girl was already waiting, ready to face the exile. A cruel command to get out screamed across the entire estate, and Aki was violently tossed out of the lavish home of Highness. The brothers sneered that his death in the forest would be shrugged off as just another run-of-the-mill accident. Willem snapped, venom dripping from every word, saying Aki wasn't his brother anymore, and that he barely even belonged to this family. Jill burst into wild laughter and tore into him, calling him a worthless nobody with skills that were completely useless. Finally, Willem pinned the boy's head to the dirt with his filthy boot and growled that the father was done swallowing this shame. A twisted, delighted grin snapped across the tormentor's face like victory. Willem acted like he was defending his brother, claiming those words would only push Jill to the guy's nerves. Then he smirked and admitted it. With trash like that, Aki somehow still had the gift of making people laugh. Even the guards leaned in and said, "That weakling's got one little flaw, and out in the wild forest, he won't make it past day one." Aki froze in place in front of them, clutching his lone backpack like it was his last lifeline. Jill closed the distance again, smirking as she dared him to test that new trash skill right this second. Jill nodded, staring at the grass beneath her feet. "Go on," she murmured. "Sink in and feast right here." The boy froze in front of the massive iron gate guarding the Gina's territory, and when the heavy doors cracked open, a deep rumble shook the air. One step past the wall, and when he turned around, all that stretched out before him was an endless emptiness and savage forests packed with monsters, turning his exile into a death sentence. The moment he was free, the boy stretched like a cat and let out a long, happy sigh of relief. He finally let out a real, heartfelt smile, because in this world, he was the eldest son of a viscount, but that title didn't bring him a shred of joy. The boy clenched his fists, because being thrown into another world with not a single lick of freedom wasn't just bad, it was pure, unbearable torment. They basically locked him at home, drilled him on etiquette and sciences, and even shoved him through brutal fencing training, just to mask how totally hopeless he was. Now the boy could finally breathe easy. No more mockery, no more bullying, and he was set on sprinting to the nearest city to forge a brand new life. Suddenly the sky turned black, and a brutal downpour slammed into the forest thickets. For the past few days, he's only managed to bring down a handful of tiny beasts, but thankfully, the monsters still haven't tracked him down. But the guy knew, if he kept going like this, he wouldn't make it much longer. Huddled under a soggy shelter of snapped branches, the freezing young man swallowed his pride and realized, too late, that the new world was nowhere near as survivable as he'd hoped. His only escape was he could eat any plant. Still, chomping raw grass was a brutal test his stomach barely survived. Suddenly, strange letters from an unknown interface flashed across his vision like a warning he didn't understand. A message popped on the screen. Turns out the plant-eating skill had boosted his stamina like crazy. Then, one more system window suddenly blazed to life. And that same power didn't just help him, it also supercharged the boy's magic, making it surge even higher. He lounged under a branch-made shelter, calmly chewing on a blade of grass. Then, out of nowhere, a weird rustling snapped his attention. Even though the boost was barely anything, and nowhere near the cutthroat cheating powers other aristocrats brag about, he still felt relieved, because at least he hadn't turned into a total loser. From the moment he was born, his own relatives treated him like trash, because to them, this powerless boy was just dead weight in the way of their big, power-hungry plans. A sudden sound snapped his attention to full alert, and a chilling thought hit him. Something wild was closing in. Cutting through the pounding rain, he spotted a tiny, lonely figure standing alone. From under the hood, a trembling, tear-soaked girl, leaf tucked in her hair, that odd, thin tail trailing behind her, stared right at him. Feeling a stranger's presence behind her, the girl jerked with raw fear. The boy froze in shock, trying to wrap his head around how a tiny child could possibly be wandering alone out there in the wild forest. The girl suddenly flashed her razor-sharp shark teeth, leaned in close and whispered, "I'm hungry," like a threat from the deep. The boy bolted toward her, frantically shouting, "Are you okay?" She pitched forward in helpless shock, and he just stood there, utterly frozen and confused. Then, the forest suddenly exploded into a thunderous roar, and that's where it all started. She sneered at him and called him a complete idiot. The young man tore through the brush, breathless, replaying every lecture in his head, because at the academy, nobody ever warned him about giants like these. In front of him wasn't just some girl, it was a full-blown nightmare stitched together from roots and vines. She laughed at how fast he cracked under her tears, and then he dropped his weapon. One bold step, and with a chilling calm, the guy let it sink in. Soon, everyone would finally see who the real fool was. While the monster cackled, getting ready to devour its prey, the young man just stared back, ice calm, mystified by how stupid it was to strike without even testing its own abilities. The predator froze in confusion. His captive didn't fight back at all, just swallowed hard like he'd walked in to have dinner. Trapped in a death grip of vines, the boy flashed a dangerous grin, because he wasn't about to waste his life here, and the system had already buzzed that he'd be getting the absorption and speed skills. He clenched his fist hard, and then, whoa! Foreign energy roared through his veins like it owned him. A wild grin stretched across his face as the boy thought, what would happen if I ate the whole creature, every single bite? One bite and bam, a massive surge of power exploded inside him, so unreal it made ordinary weeds feel like nothing. The monster, trapped in a girl's body, hissed with raw rage, promising it would squeeze the life out of its prey. The boy flung his arms wide in a single burst and ripped the thick chains apart, snapping the attacker into stunned silence. A sharp crack split the air, and the plant stems exploded in the scattered fragments. He nonchalantly stepped right over the wreckage of a trap that used to be deadly. The terrified girl perched atop her deadly predatory plant just froze and blinked in pure disbelief, completely stunned by what had happened. Meanwhile, his indicators shot up again, and right there in the menu, a brand new courage skill lit up like a lifeline. The boy shot out his hand, yanked his opponent by that long ponytail, and hauled her straight into his grip. With a brutal scream, the attacker slammed headfirst onto the grass. His lips twisted into a sinister grin, and a shadowy look snapped into his eyes. He slowly cracked his fingers, hovering over the enemy he'd brought down. The boy had already swung to hit him, yelling that listening to monsters was forbidden, when the girl beneath the tree suddenly broke down and cried out, pleading. His fist hovered a millimeter from her face. The girl let out a shaky breath of relief, clamped her hands over her head, and trembled like fear had her by the throat. He gave a cold, sharp command to yank the prisoner out at once, and she instantly nodded and obeyed. Sobbing uncontrollably, she clung to the massive tree's trunk and hissed that it was her very first prey. As she scrambled to get ready, the guy narrowed his eyes and demanded, "Come on, can you really pull her back?" Right in front of him, that giant tree trunk suddenly groaned, cracked open, and split along its seams. The boy locked eyes on that slender girl sprawled on the grass, and his mind couldn't stop spinning as he tried to figure out exactly who she was. The plant monster crumpled into the air with a violent hiss, and there was the rescued elf sprawled on the ground, groaning that she couldn't digest it at all because the mana was absolutely insane. She snapped that she was done fighting for good, and the boy instantly understood. The giant tree was nothing but her outer shell. With her arms crossed tight, the little one proudly announced, "I'm Rin, big great spirit," and waved off that scary wooden monster like it was nothing. Rage boiling in his veins. But wait, the boy just remembered his plant-eating trick actually worked, proving it really was a herb, and Rin stood there, completely dumbfounded. With a furious glare, she snapped that it hurt like hell, while he flashed an awkward smile, baffled at how on earth he'd even managed to bite her. As the horned girl flailed with rage, the boy calmly picked up the unconscious guest and carried them straight to his tent. The tiny one snapped, furious that her silly horn and tail look was the real shape of a mighty spirit. With barely enough strength to blink, the injured elf cracked one eye open and flinched at the surprise, while, miles away in that lavish estate, her relatives had already started mentally mourning her savior. At the long dining table, a chilly silence hung in the air while the family sneered at the outcast, because they already knew that without proper gear, he wouldn't last a second out there against the monsters. The brothers burst into open laughter and claimed the loser either got chewed up by some monster or crawled out to gorge himself on forest grass because he was starving. Deep in those forest shadows, ancient elves stay hidden, out of sight. Father froze for a second, then lifted the glass to his lips as if he'd just made a big decision. He cut his sons off cold and warned them, "Elves aren't fairy tales. Those realms of theirs sit right on Ginas, next to their own lands." The old man snapped, asking what those legends had to do with that total loser, and the father shot back that, for the two of them, this was the chance of a lifetime. For generations, their bloodline was tasked with forging peace with the forest folk, and even after a whole 100 years with no sign of them, bringing that alliance back meant one thing: massive political power. Even 300 years later, the hero who befriended the elves and gained access to their one-of-a-kind magical tech is still celebrated like legend. The younger brother smirked the moment he understood it. Forest people's values don't match humans at all, so their treasures could be baited away for literally nothing. The elder son spun a razor-sharp knife in his fingers, grinning like a villain, and taunted his father. "So it's true, huh? Every elf is born a flawless beauty?" Father took a sharp sip of wine, then barked at his brothers to forge their strength for the coming rain, because elves don't show up in human history more than once every few hundred years. The blazing sun drenched the mansion's white stone walls in golden light. With a drink in hand, the Lord stared out the window and felt it click. Meeting the elves would lock his family's power in place for good, and now he had to hit that mysterious forest again. A soft voice drifted beneath the dense canopy of the trees, like a secret whisper pulling you in. The boy dropped to one knee before the rescued girl, asked if she was okay, and then quietly, "What's your name?" The girl looked totally stunned. Just seconds ago, something had nearly swallowed her whole. She jolted at the shock of what she just realized, and the boy calmly reached out, offering his hand and promising to take her back to his camp. Heat rushed into the girl's cheeks. She couldn't wrap her head around it. This young man had saved her life again. For years and years, all she could think about was one burning mission: finding him again. The boy carefully slipped his clothes onto her shoulders, and when she met his eyes, she knew this was it. After 3 long hundred years, she was finally going to keep the promise. He carefully clasped her delicate hands, leaned in close, and murmured that he'd finally keep the promise he swore 300 years ago. The scared elf girl stared at the boy in shock when he gently asked, "Are you okay?" after everything she'd just survived. The elf girl jolted upright, and the young man cried out in panic for her to stay down, but she only blinked, remembering the monster that had just attacked her. The moment she realized she was naked, the elf girl's face erupted in a blush, rushing all the way up to the tips of her long ears. Overwhelmed by the swirling emotion, the beauty crumpled and collapsed onto the grass, and the guy immediately panicked, yelling for his fussy partner to come help. The young man let out a heavy sigh, cursed the missing ether, and then hauled the exhausted guest under his warm cloak. Soon, a warm, cheerful fire snapped and crackled in the heart of the forest, while the rescued elf girl drifted off in a cozy, homemade hammock. Meanwhile, tiny Rin just started cracking dry meat like it was her job, no manners at all, and she kept blasting her grumbles because her companion's food stash was way too meager. When the tiny one proudly proclaimed herself a great spirit, the boy just shrugged and told her to go back to photosynthesis, flat out doubting those plants had anything friendly in their nature. Chewing on both sides, Rin doubled down. She insisted she loved meat. Then he cut in and snapped her away right before she could land her first catch. She folded her arms tight, irritation snapping in her voice, and reminded everyone that the guest had almost ended up as her lunch, so yeah, there was zero room for jokes. Staring into the flames, the young man snapped, "So tell me, why are you even following me after all of this?" And the girl only smiled back, like it was about to get wild and fun with him. That single chunk of the monstrous plant blasted the boy with a ridiculous flood of experience, and the system popped up instantly, declaring new absorption and nourishment skills unlocked. His little beast girl companion tore into the prey too, chomping like she meant it, and then, with hopeful eyes, she asked if he was finally going to eat her now. The boy froze, blinking in pure confusion at the wild question, while the little girl kept flailing her arms in frantic panic. Suddenly she shrieked in terror, eyes bulging wide with pure panic. A soft moan slipped from behind, and the boy snapped around, while the girl recoiled in terror all over again. The elf girl who'd been captured finally snaps back into herself. The boy asked gently how she was holding up, all while he shoved aside that pesky beast girl who kept fretting like she was one step away from getting eaten. He spotted that the rescued girl had nothing on, so he fumbled and offered her his own clothes, only to shock his tiny companion, who had zero idea what clothing was supposed to mean. Heat flooded her cheeks with pure shame, so the elf girl yanked on a jacket and blurted out apologies for the whole mess, until the boy rushed in, insisting it was his fault, all because of that sneaky little troublemaker. Then the girl shot her hands up in pride and, snap, sent out a whole, perfectly intact dress. She bragged that she couldn't digest fabric, then she swallowed the elf girl alive, and the shocked girl immediately recognized the outfit she'd worn before the abduction. The boy nearly recoiled in disgust, blurting out if she really pulled that out of her stomach. Then she shot back, furious, that it wasn't gross at all, it was her magical storage. The red elf snatched her stuff and bolted into the bushes to make a quick switch. And the beast girl only beamed at them, warm and genuine, right up until they walked out. The boy stared in shock because they were calling a spatial storage spell magic, and not just any magic, but the ridiculously high-level kind. The girl shot back with proud confidence that, to the Great Spirit, all of it was nothing but tiny trifles. Then she decked the whole place out with mushrooms and flowers. A sharp thought hit him. If he'd eaten Rin back then, he'd be standing here now with her magical powers coursing through him. The young man whipped his arm through the air and carved a dark pocket dimension rift like it was nothing, and Rin froze, staring in pure shock. Rin tried to mask her jealousy with sharp, insulting screams. But then, out of nowhere, the bushes rustled, and when she saw someone's leg, panic ripped through her as she shrieked. She hurriedly stuffed her cheeks with herbs, determined to prove that her stash was useful, no matter what it took. Right from the bushes in front of them, a graceful elf named Sarah stepped out, stiff as a statue, as she stumbled through an awkward "thank you" for saving her, and the boy immediately froze, completely spellbound by her beauty. The moment she stepped forward, he still couldn't process what he was seeing. Then he blurted out Rin's name. Sarah started telling how elves nurture spirits to trade for magic, then snapped her eyes wide because what stood before her wasn't a monster at all, but a real spirit. That crushed her tiny pride to the bone. She tore forward, screaming at the girl, promising to chomp her as payback. The boy yanked his unruly companion by the head, and she squealed in furious indignation as he quickly shut her down. The elf bowed with perfect grace, admitted she never would have made it without their help, and stumbled through her thanks like every word was suddenly too big to fit. The boy stared at the elf's terrifying power, stunned that even carnivorous plants keeled over once that magic blasted them. Turns out the spirit's own body would rot from the inside if it tried to digest an elf, and Rin practically recoiled in sheer horror. The rescued elf girl froze in place, cheeks burning, her hand clamped to her chest as pure embarrassment swallowed her whole. Aki scratched the back of his head in a panic, introduced himself along with his gloomy buddy Rin, and then blurted that saving her was just coincidence, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The elf, trembling with nerves, finally summoned the courage to invite Aki to her home village. The boy froze in shock, staring like his whole world just hit rewind. She grinned from ear to ear and swore she wasn't teasing. They were coming to a real elven village. The only time he'd ever heard of these hidden people was in dusty old books. So when the invitation finally landed in his lap, his heart started pounding like it was about to explode. On the way, Aki suddenly thought of an old debt of gratitude and pressed his companion, asking how she could recognize him as the descendant of the clan that saved her relatives 300 years ago. While Rin skipped along, humming cheerfully and dreaming of a big reward, Aki fumed through clenched teeth, blaming it all on her own stupid mistake. The elf burst with excitement and told the guest, "In my village, we've got an ancient portrait of the savior, and you look like him, like 2 drops of water." The boy could only pray in his own head that he wasn't some random double. Then Rin suddenly erupted, screaming, and pointed straight ahead. Just ahead, a whole settlement had grown in the massive canopies of ancient trees, and a totally different way of life was thriving up there. One of the wooden house doors creaked open, inch by inch. Majestic Sheila strode to the doorway, beaming at the guests and thanking them for risking everything to save her daughter. The boy froze in shock at the twist. Those Sarahs they'd rescued weren't just survivors, they were an elven princess, and the guards creeping behind them gasped in disbelief at the sudden sight of a human. The regal elf queen just smiled softly and told her guest, "Don't worry, help like this is nothing." As the boy snapped at his mischievous companion, begging for even a sliver of remorse, the ruler only let out a quiet, weary sigh. Suddenly, the proud elf Nieto cut into the conversation, fire in her voice as she snapped at her mother. Was this human boy really the very same descendant? The queen snapped at her daughter right away, reminding her they had to show the absolute highest respect to the guest they'd been waiting for 3 straight centuries. The boy swallowed hard, and the nerves hit him like a wave. The elf shot back a cold, scornful frown. A mysterious runic symbol flickered across the air for just a split second. After invoking the ancient alliance and thanking the traveler for saving her daughter, the ruler slowly lifted her hand, like it was about to change everything. The princess snorted in pure disgust, spun around, and walked off, leaving the boy scratching his head like, "Wait, what just happened?" 3 massive magical circles snapped into place around the queen, flooding the entire tent with a blinding, radiant light. That mind-bending show nearly stole the boy's voice right out of his mouth, because this kind of spatial magic was seen as the absolute peak of magical art. Right in front of the travelers, a towering mountain of gold and dazzling treasures rose up, and the little companion burst out in shock, screaming at the top of her lungs. The elf queen broke into a warm smile and handed Akiginasu a generous reward, thanking him for the rescue with all her heart. Gold coins piled up in front of the heroes, rare jewels glittered beside them, and every exquisite treasure dazzled the eyes like a trap made of pure wealth. Nieta snapped, demanded to know if he was unhappy, and said, "See, I told you, people are just as greedy as I thought." Aki spun into panic, flailing his hands as he flat-out refused the treasures, while his tiny companion was already grinning and drooling over the gold. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the room. Nieto raged at the strangers, claiming they were teaming up with the monster that attacked her sister. The elf moved in fast and shut the screamer down, and it instantly clicked. These guests could breeze past the forest's protective barrier, proving they came with good intentions. While Aki happily slipped the rings on, the boy couldn't stop staring at the mysterious testament that had guarded this place for centuries. Those words snapped the boy wide awake. The queen didn't just answer, she crushed his doubts, revealing this contract was written ages ago by the ancestors of both sides. She flicked her hand and streams of light erupted around her. Then she made it crystal clear. The Covenant's magic works only because the elemental spirits truly trust her. The proud elf huffed in pure offense, snapping that soulless humans would never grasp how serious this really was. Elves don't just live on the land, they draw their power straight from the earth, and if they break faith with the elemental spirits, their whole race gets wiped out. Aki snapped right to the heart of it. If they broke their promise, the spirits would just walk out on them, and even that elf girl had to grudgingly admit it. The queen leaned in and warned him that turning down the gold would insult the hosts, so he had to helplessly give in and agree. Aki fumbled, scratched his cheek, and muttered that saving little Saras was no big deal. Anyone would have done it, like he hadn't just pulled off something amazing at all. He tried to say one more thing, but the words jammed in his throat. The elf by the window suddenly cut in, beckoned him over, and told him to look out. The boy snapped at the moment and demanded to know what really happened here 300 years ago, and the short-haired elf had to stop and think hard. She leaned in and whispered the bombshell. The tree of life, the only power keeping the spirits and elves alive, had started to wither, and if it went down, everything living would be wiped out. Right in front of them rose the massive, ancient tree of the world. Its gigantic roots sunk deep into the earth, like it owned the ground itself. Aki jolted in shock and blurted out, "What kind of magic potion is that?" With a grin, the interlocutor swore it was the miraculous medicine from ancestor Aki, because it's the only thing that saved the tree of the world and every last soul in their people. But that joy didn't last. Then the short-haired elf snapped that the supplies were nearly gone, and without medicine, the tree would slump again, sealing the weak's fate to death. She lifted a fragile glass vial, and inside, just a few precious remnants of something priceless still clung to the bottom. The boy locked eyes on the vessel, and when the potion vanished for good, he knew this was the end for every last elf. Aki snapped to the truth. This potion was their only shot to stop the sacred tree from withering, and they had to get it fast. And then, right there, he lit up like he was touched by something heavenly. The boy snapped back to the interloper's classic rules. The tree feeds the spirits with mana, the spirits lift the elves, and the elves guard the tree, an unbreakable loop. The elf girl anxiously called out to him, but right then, it hit him. He suddenly remembered the special potion. He snatched for the backpack in a panic. The boy pulled out an exquisite crystal bottle and held it up, and his companion's jaw dropped in pure shock. The girls stood there, utterly stunned, unable to wrap their heads around what they were seeing. They stared in shock and demanded where he got it, but Aki just gave an awkward little smile. He couldn't forget the day they booted him out of his own home and made him snatch whatever he could grab on the spot. A bottle full of liquid just sat there, half buried in a chaotic pile of junk they'd yanked together in a hurry. With a plant-eater's knack, he snatched up every bit of greenery that looked even remotely useful. Ordinary fertilizer. For 3 straight centuries, the elves kept their distance from humans, and by the time they finally looked back, everything they thought they knew about the world had already fallen behind. The boy just thrust the bottle into her hands. She frowned and jabbed her finger at the bottle, totally thrown off by what he was trying to do. She grabbed the fertilizer with shaking hands, holding her breath as pure excitement surged through her. Aki leaned in, studied her in silence, and asked, straight up, if she truly needed it. Elven Queen Sheila burst into tears of joy when the boy handed her new hope, no old debt repaid, just a bright future. She yanked the confused boy close and wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him tight like he was finally safe. She swore her entire life was his to command, and the younger elf went wide-eyed, like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. The girl shot red with embarrassment and screamed that some greedy creep would have demanded something indecent, while poor Aki just sat there, sweating buckets in silence. Aki stared at that towering crown with hope blazing in her eyes and asked, "Can these medicines really save the tree of the world?" Both girls flushed hot, fists tightening at their sides, bracing for impact. Sheila flashed a gentle smile and urged the boy to finally confess the real desire burning inside him. Aki beamed with real warmth and asked, "Can I just take one leaf from the tree of the world?" Every single one of them just froze in stunned silence. Then the queen clutched her own face like she couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. Meanwhile, that little fang-bearer girl sprawled around like it was a playground, tumbling through heaps of gold coins with zero worries. On Gina's lands, a luxurious estate threw open its gates to a truly distinguished guest that day. The summer host with the monocle couldn't mask his shock. Lord Javel himself had marched in, face to face, just to see him. The dark wine wobbled in the crystal glass as the guest, cool as ice, slowly dragged his palm across the covered table. Staring up at the city's towering stone walls, he finally admitted the truth. Out here, he couldn't trust anyone with this secret. Javel said, with zero hesitation, that as the kingdom's Minister of Internal Affairs, it's his direct duty to handle it. The ruler of Jinasu slowly lifted his glass, flashed a smile, and said the last 10 years had come and gone with zero outside threats, so power battles had shifted inward, straight into the mess of politics. Javel suddenly slammed his glass onto the table, then murmured that even his high chair was wobbling now. The master smirked like he knew a secret, took a sharp sip, and said it loud. This dangerous political chess match is being led right now by the Minister of Internal Affairs. He reminded everyone that in peacetime, the fight for power never calms down, it only sharpens, and that's why these borderlands suddenly became the single most important spot in the whole country. Suddenly, that tense silence shattered as a red-haired young guy leaned in by the door with a mocking grin, telling the guest to quit acting like a fool and teasing the legendary treasure of Ginasu. The minister's expression snapped cold in an instant, and he shot a suspicious look like, "So what is this all about?" Then the Summer Lord inched closer, eyes flashing with a predator's hunger, and he dropped 2 chilling words. "About the elves." That hit the minister like a punch. He went dead still, a cold sweat sliding down his cheek as those guys stared him down with icy, unblinking eyes. The estate's lord threw his arms wide and declared in triumph that these incredible creatures show up once every few centuries, bringing mountains of wealth and rare knowledge. And even if regular folks swear it's just a myth, their existence has been logged for ages in royal archives as undeniable history. The guest smirked like he already knew it. Lord Genus was secretly digging into the latest incident himself. A few days back, Lady Hina, the captain of the knightly order, stumbled into the forest and uncovered a mysterious magical barrier at the heart of it all. Even with every knightly rule nailed down tight, the guest still rushed in to blurt the truth. Everything on these lands belongs to Genus. The lord quietly tipped his glass and drank deep. His counterpart narrowed his eyes through that monocle, pressing for a straight answer. Did they really have that special connection or not? He said that if they pulled this off, the Lord's family would skyrocket into fame, and his sons would suddenly be flooded with marriage proposals. The kingdom is hunting for a real link with the elves, and the only bridge that can make it happen is Ginas's lands. With a booming laugh, the guest lifted his glass and tossed out the news like it was nothing. His third daughter was about to walk down the aisle. Then he steered the talk straight to the master's oldest son, Aki, the one who was still single. Hina's face drained of color in an instant. A cold sweat erupted, and she froze, couldn't even find the words. The guest didn't push, just asked him to think it over, and with the boy, they sprinted straight for the exit. The alliance with the elves would shower Ginas with enough wealth to buy him a lifetime seat in the government. Two adventurous brothers marched through the hall with total swagger, and the younger one flashed a greedy grin, already fantasizing that once he'd captured the elves, he'd finally drown in gold. A cocky stride forward, and he shoots Jill a quick, sharp question. The older brother just sneered and shrugged it off, said the fate of some loser meant nothing to him, because first they had to make it to the elven lands. His companion pumped a victorious fist, sneering that the eldest son's death wouldn't even slow them down, because once they had the elven riches, nothing else mattered. From behind the leaves near that tall tree, a terrifying whisper hissed, warning that these people are pure danger. Jill curled into a fierce, predatory grin, hissed that he'd set the entire forest ablaze, burn it all down if it meant reaching his goal. Rage flushed. The enraged elf burst into her community and screamed that nobody could be trusted anymore because they were coming straight for the world tree itself. The majestic elf brushed a hand over the tree's trunk and, with calm intensity, asked Aki why he did it. As the younger girl blurted out that it was only one torn leaf, her friend erupted in panic, yelling that even that tiniest crime was absolutely unforgivable. The boy gave this shaky, awkward grin and scratched the back of his head, wrestling with himself over whether he should finally spill his secret. He could absorb plants and get stronger. Suddenly, the little spirit girl with a leaf perched on her head snapped her eyes wide open and shouted, beaming, that Aki had eaten her too. A heavy, bone-chilling silence slammed down over the entire room. She broke down in tears and screamed that the boy had forced her into it, telling everyone it hurt her so badly. The elf girls flushed hard with shame and shock, scrambling to make sense of the little one's teasing words about the very first time something like this happened to her. As the elf girls hissed that he was a criminal, Rin's panic hit like a wave. He blurted that he never meant to eat anyone, insisting he'd only nibbled the naked Saras a little. Sarah sprawled in the flower meadow, stunned, still clueless why that strange red baby had picked her out and attacked her. Suddenly, a chilling sound ripped through the forest, and when it hit, their magical barrier proved utterly useless. Then the majestic queen of the elves finally figured it out. Aki's special power was simple. The more plants he absorbs, the stronger he gets. The elder elf gently lifted little Rina onto her lap, then softly, yet with real emotion, thanked Aki for saving their home. The awkward boy blurted out the truth about his weird power, and Nato just let out a heavy sigh, grumbling that human logic was impossible to even understand. She spun on her heel and made a point of turning her back. Then, out of nowhere, Nato glanced at him again, cheeks burning as she fumbled for the right words. The queen demanded permission to unveil Aki to the villagers as their benefactor, and to spill that gifted potion straight into the world tree. Little Sarasa lifted that lavish floral wreath with trembling hands, holding her breath as pure awe crashed over her. In her sparkling eyes, real happiness lit up like fireflies, and petals spun slowly through the air like they were dancing just for her. Nieto suddenly bolted to the window and screamed in pure shock at what was staring back at her outside. On the other side of that wall, something massive rumbled. Everyone in the room snapped upright, heart pounding, startled out of their seats. The girl's body locked up in sudden terror, and she barely squeezed out a whispering question, silent but shaking with fear. Black strands of sinister energy ripped through the forest settlement fast, swallowing the sky in a suffocating, choking cloud. Fresh claw marks have torn into the ancient tree's trunk, cutting deep grooves as if something feral just passed through. The young man leaned toward the window, heart hammering as he anxiously scanned the street. He froze by the railing, eyes locked on the thing charging out of the forest. They huddled by the window, twisting in anxious suspense, staring straight at that gap, while Aki fought to make sense of what was unfolding there. From the dark forest, a heavy, ominous aura oozed straight toward the village like it had a mission. Aki leaned in and told the little spirit Rin, and she practically bounced with a thrilled nod, confirming that a massive, earth-shaking power had finally arrived. Rin wasted zero time, taunting the guy with her great spirit status until irritation flared in his eyes and he snapped, demanding the details. She practically radiated with pride, glowing like she'd just won the whole world. Aki remembered that wild power to copy whatever plants he ate, and he decided to forge a deep connection with the forest. The boy's mind snapped shut as darkness swallowed everything. Right in the dead center of the void, a blinding white flash erupted like a gunshot from the darkness. The energy started to fade, like its power was slipping out of the room. Right in front of his eyes, the shapes of forest trees snapped into view, sharp and unmistakable. Aki stumbled back in shock, realizing he wasn't just looking at the world, he was seeing it through the eyes of forest spirits. At last, the elf understood the boy had truly eaten the Great Spirit, and when that truth hit, Rin herself was forced to panic at how completely her authority had fallen apart. The boy finally convinced himself his plant eater was the real deal, and it was seriously something special. Aki's calm words shattered the elf's last doubts. He'd absorbed every power from the green he'd eaten. The young man strode up to the window and locked his gaze on the night-dark thicket beyond it. That silent companion with the long braid just sat there, quietly watching them from the side. His eyes suddenly locked on something, like the world hit pause. The animal sprinted away, refusing to look back even once. A giant beast tore through the forest with a deafening, ferocious roar that split the air in two. A colossal, demonic bear pinned a tiny white creature while a girl fidgeted, grilling a boy about what he'd just seen by the window. Panting, the elf maidens hurried to the hero and spilled the terrifying news. Something monstrous had snapped loose and gone feral deep in the thickets. A gigantic, demonic bear with blazing, burning eyes rampaged through everything, smashing walls, shredding ancient trees with savage claws. A brutal claw strike tore the thicket clean in two. Suddenly, the settlement's protective barrier split with a soft, chilling ring, and terror crashed over the girls like a wave. At last, the magical shield finally cracked and shattered into 1,000 pieces. The young man went rigid, sensing a power surging in that felt way more lethal than any forest beast. From the sawdust and the thick darkness, a majestic warrior burst forth in gleaming armor, cold fury in his grip as he seized a bare blade. She stood tall with fierce confidence, like she'd been born to charge into battle. The guard figured the barrier didn't just fail, it got smashed when the knight's strike sent out an ordinary shockwave right after the monster went down. With a mysterious vial clutched in her hands, the elf stared in disbelief, trying to figure out why that knightly order dared to march into their territory. The young man shot down their optimism, grimly insisting that beating a bear doesn't automatically turn strangers into friends, while the girls still clung to that dream. She didn't have a second to think. She tore into her mom's emergency spell, whipping a spinning ring of water as potions flared above her head. The amazing elixir spilled onto the sacred tree's roots, and in a blink it erupted in dazzling light, blooming right before their eyes like magic. A little girl with a ponytail sprinted up to the glowing tree, bursting out loud with pure, happy excitement. Aki leaned in, studied the rich leaves, and then it hit him. This ordinary fertilizer was the reason the elves had been thanking him with all their heart. The boy snatched a falling leaf from the world tree, and once Sheila's magic hit it, that little plant flashed with its real, terrifying power. The elf mother pressed a bundle of rare healing herbs into Aki's hands, herbs everyone swore by, famous across these lands for sacred, life-saving power. With her head bowed, tears streaming down her face, she begged his pardon for all the times she'd pushed him, then still pleaded for his mighty power to save them. The system window flashed an insane jump in his stamina and magic power from just plain grass, and he couldn't help but grin at the secret punch healing plants were hiding. Staring at the wild glow in his hands, Aki's heart pounded, half thrilled, half terrified, because he couldn't stop wondering what his body would turn into if he finally dared to eat these sacred plants. Hina dropped in from above and leapt onto the furry beast, sword already slashing through the air. Hina quietly lowered her weapon and stopped dead, frozen in the thick, breath-holding silence. From the thicket, a panicked old knight in a battered helmet burst out, demanding if everything was okay, while his squad instantly felt a massive threat closing in. He burst ahead and roared the commander's name at the top of his lungs. The subordinate stood there, stunned to the core, murmuring in disbelief that the girl had just smashed that monster in one single blow. On the clearing floor, a giant Grizztill's corpse sprawled out with its tongue lolling, right there, the prize they'd been chasing. The wind finally quit screaming, and the forest slid back into peaceful silence. Her eyes sharpened like steel, cold and locked on the target. She called the old Marvell, and he snapped upright on instinct, practically vibrating with anticipation for her next command. Kina handed him a squad and with zero warmth ordered him to carry out one urgent mission right away. A terrifying scream ripped through the forest silence, shouting for Commander Kina. The guard on duty barely had a second to gasp before the sudden rustle from the left threw him into instant, frantic confusion. Hina barreled through the thicket, startling the forest squirrels as she tried to untangle the chaos pounding inside her skull. As she sprinted, the girl replayed that eerie barrier around the forest, and the moment it clicked, she knew her suspicions about who made it would drag her into serious trouble. She had to rush to signal everyone, loud and clear, that she wasn't a threat, and she had to prove it fast. After that wild sprint, dizziness hit her hard. She'd totally misjudged how far her stamina could take her. Near the village, chaos erupted as the guards spotted a terrifying monster barreling toward them at full speed. The terrified elf burst into panic, screaming at our hero to shove the herbs he'd gathered down right now before the enemy closed in. She shakily pointed into the forest thicket, terrified the very monster that wiped out their last enemy was charging straight for them. The boy didn't argue at all. He gulped down the first mouthful of leaves in one shot, and a thick heaviness sank into his throat. The little horned kids giggled as they dumped fresh bundles of plants over him, burying him deeper and deeper, while their friend's outrage got totally ignored. Suddenly, the space around the young man detonated into a blinding pillar of light, slamming both girls backward. The very first message flashed in front of his eyes: divine protection of fire, granted because he could devour plants. In the blink of an eye, his status lit up with a flood of messages about water, wind, and earth. Then all of it snapped together into one unstoppable force. After chowing down on another weird helping of strange plants, Aki unlocked a brand new skill, wisdom, and his stats shot up so fast it felt like the universe itself just leveled him. The nearby elf girls gasped as they watched the boy's magical reserve swell at terrifying speed. The very next second, one of the elf girls snapped to attention, her eyes wide as she froze, staring at something right beside him. That tiny spirit shot up into the sky with pure joy, and the boy's friends all lit up with big smiles. Suddenly, the little one lunged onto Aki's face and, grinning wide, proclaimed himself the Great Spirit. A brand new notification hit the screen instantly. Because he's been chowing down on plants, he's finally allowed to strike a deal with this deity. They pressed foreheads to seal the deal, and in that instant, Aki unlocked a brand new power, Spirit's Veil. The tiny kid let out a shocked squeak. Aki's voice cracked as she shouted Rin's name, trembling with fear. Her body vanished into thin air, and a burst of magic aura swept the boy up in a furious whirlwind. For a brief second, she popped her head out of the cocoon with a bright, cheerful grin. The companions leaned in, holding their breath. Aki's body burst into a blazing flare of spiritual power, and his tiny assistant sat proud on his shoulder. Aki bolted the second he got his new power, hurling stones as he sprinted through the air, all while his new winged partner cheered him on. In the end, he crumpled helplessly to the ground, while the little one just giggled on his head, soaking up the whole spectacle like it was the best thing ever. The young man yanked the little winged companion in his grasp and demanded she never, ever take over his body again. He clenched her fingers tight, gripping like he'd never let go. She popped onto his head like it was a throne, grinned wide, and jabbed at the next target's direction. The boy muttered that even a spoiled spirit still packs serious power, and the little one snapped back, furious that she was totally fresh and not spoiled at all. He clung to control with everything he had, even as a colossal force tore and raged inside him. With that kind of support, he could finally go toe-to-toe with the enemy, for real. The white-haired warrior went rigid the moment she spotted a shadow blasting toward her down the forest path. They slammed into each other with a furious punch that made the air shudder and cracked the ground under their feet. With sheer horror, the girl realized she'd picked up too much speed. Now there was no way to stop. A brutal explosion ripped through the area, blasting dust pillars into the sky and flattening nearby trees. The tiny elves stared in shock, their mouths hanging open. The kids were buzzing with excitement, yelling about how fast she tore across the scene and how loud everything erupted in explosions. Right in front of them, a massive crater tore open the broken earth, and the kids burst out in one thrilled roar. Aki shoved wild plants in her mouth, chewing like she couldn't waste a second, while the system notifications kept popping up about her health recovering. Hina sank into a deep bow before him, cheeks burning with shame as she begged for forgiveness. She said the elite capital knight got so swallowed up in the fight that during the mission he accidentally smashed the elves' protective barrier. The boy dropped his hands onto his hips, worn out, and tried to wrap his head around the sheer insanity he'd just heard. Elves behind him roared in fury, glaring at the wreckage, those fallen trees and the giant crater sitting right in the middle of the village. Then it all somehow turned out okay, because Aki snapped into action and threw herself in front of little Nieto just as the rockfall came crashing down. A friend leaned in and whispered that their village was crazy lucky. The rescuer finally showed up. Nieto stared at Aki's face, trying to crack the code of what she was feeling. The girl hesitated, then grudgingly nodded along, the idea of thanking him later sticking in her throat. She slipped away in silence, like the whole world couldn't hear her leaving. Hina stared at the boy, stunned. She never thought the eldest son of the Hina's family would be that strong. When the girl tried to save herself with, "I just fixate on one goal," Aki only lifted an eyebrow, pure, skeptical doubt. Hina shot out another heartfelt apology, fully owning every bit of chaos she'd left behind. She felt this huge relief that not a single elf got hurt, but wow, she couldn't believe how few people in the capital could actually calm her down when she was that shaken. She flushed hot, cringed at herself for being an awkward, rude mess, and then, straight from the heart, thanked Aki for showing up. The young man just smiled in silence. Sure, she was dangerous, but still good at heart, and knowing they had an ally like that inside the government felt like pure opportunity. The majestic queen nodded, remembering that it was those hateful human beliefs that once pushed the elves to forge the protective barrier in the first place. Still, the young elf girl narrowed her eyes and kept glaring. She couldn't figure out why the human king needed new allies at all, until the boy just smiled and said, "You can never have too many strong allies." The sacred tree has roared back to life. The forest's magic is surging stronger than ever, but you can't ignore that Aki and Hina are showing up with powers way beyond normal. The queen declared it was time to forge a brand new alliance, just like Aki's ancestor once did, while the other elves cowered and muttered in terror behind her. And people were whispering that once Aki gained power, she didn't turn evil. She proved that strength doesn't always corrupt. The elf let out a haughty snort and declared she'd only team up with humans if every last one of them was as soft and clueless as Aki. Hina just smiled, eyes shining, and confessed her real job in the forest wasn't hunting monsters at all. It was quietly studying those strange, mysterious thickets. She practically squealed with excitement, slamming her hands against the armor because the royal capital was banking everything on this search. With a sharp, serious stare, the girl locked eyes with Aki and reminded him that making peace with the elves had been humanity's dream for ages. Suddenly, this little girl with quirky fangs zipped in through the window, grinning from ear to ear as she flashed the bright wreath the village boy had handed her as a tribute. The second Hina spotted that incredible guest, control snapped for her. She burst forward with a wild scream, and Aki yanked back in pure terror. Aki snapped his bearings and yanked the little troublemaker by the hood, and she huffed that she wasn't causing trouble, she was just bored, doing recon. The knightess blushed bright, and her eyes lit up like true flames the moment she laid eyes on that adorable little cutie. Once he clocked the girl's charming glow and the floral wreath perched on her head, the knight snapped to the truth. This wasn't just any stranger, it was an unbelievably sweet flower fairy. The little one stamped her feet in fury and screamed, "I'm not some boring fairy, I'm a mighty great spirit!" But Hina totally brushed off her cries, grinning as she kept staring in awe at her soft green hair and those big, mystical eyes. The knightess nearly keeled over, murmuring, barely holding it together, that this tiny thing is priceless and that its fluffiness sends shivers straight down her spine. At that exact moment, a merciless hand yanked the great spirit by its long tail, and it squealed, panicking like it couldn't breathe. Eyes still shut, palms clasped like prayer, she murmured that spirits fuel every drop of energy in the world. And yeah, spirits aren't just there. They're the living mystery of the world, twined with elves since the dawn of time. She snapped, furious that she wasn't weightless at all. Yet the night only collapsed from her fluffiness, sparks flying everywhere. The warrior and the elf girl froze dead in their tracks, completely stunned. Terrified, the spirit shrieked and dove behind the boy, while the warrior woman burst into joyful tears, completely melting at how adorable it was. The knightess tried to cough up confidence and fix her face into something serious, but Aki just smirked and deadpanned that pretending to be tough was already way too late. The embarrassed girl shoved her face into the floor and sobbed, while the boy let out a huge, helpless sigh at all this trouble. The boy rushed up to the elf and soothed her fast, proving that a gentle, quirky guardian beats some dull stick-in-the-mud any day. Still, the elf only grimaced, giving the whole human race a side-eye like, "Yeah, I don't think you're mentally okay." Voyachka quietly covered her longtime weakness for anything cute with a neat little explanation. As the elf maidens worried about humans marching in for conquest, the guest stood her ground and insisted, loud and clear, that she had come in peace. Her eyes hardened into ice as she swore she'd stand as a shield and a blade for the defenseless and strike down anyone who dared to commit violence. Aki snapped back to one crucial detail out of nowhere. The girl said, dead confident, that the radicals would quake to oppose the powerful Hina's family, especially with Aki standing right there as their ally. The moment he spoke up, the boy calmly crushed her hopes. He'd been kicked out of his home ages ago, and now he was just a plain, ordinary commoner. The deafening bang shoved her off balance, and she just froze, mouth hanging open in shock. The armored girl clenched her fists and flashed a confident grin, like she was daring fate to get in her way. Rin erupted in loud laughter after hearing that Aki got kicked out of his own home. Saras clocked it immediately. Aki, that unemployed homeless kid, looked shady from the start, while the boy yanked at Rin's hair like he was fuming. The elf girl beamed softly, and at last, everything finally turned out right. Saras rushed to comfort Aki over the title she lost, while Rin's mind snapped back to that forest camp, where she remembered how she'd charged at them. Aki broke into a sincere smile and told him, "This exile gave me everything. I used it to save Saras." Saras grinned and confirmed it, and the moment the truth landed, it hit Rin like a truck. Night Hina let out a heartbreaking sigh, whispering that if Akira hadn't been expelled, she'd have gotten gobbled up too, and they'd have both rotted inside that monster's stomach. Aki stumbled over his words and apologized to Hina. Because of his family mess, she'd been crushed into thinking the Hina house was her only hope, and that even that was gone. The girl snapped her gaze up and said the problem wasn't Genus's house at all. It was the powerful factions pulling its strings. Supporters of Internal Affairs Minister Count Juvella tried to worm their way to the elves by using the House of Genus to grab power, while everyone else flat out refused any alliance with half-humans. Aki rubbed his chin, eyes narrowing as he finally realized just how filthy this whole political game really was. Greedy aristocrats didn't want peace or power for the good of all. They wanted total control over the elves. Hina finally admitted she now understood his noble heart, and the elves were ready to welcome Aki as their ally, someone who could forge a pact with a great spirit. Now the kingdom's liaison duties to the elves have finally slid from the House of Genus over to Aki, and for a moment it felt like this whole thing was going to be easy. The Knight's commander told everyone that the whole political chess match in the capital splits cleanly into two halves. As the tiny demon yawned right there, the elf tiptoed up and grilled it. What on earth did that yawn even mean? Behind the royal palace walls, a hidden war burned. Radicals tried to enslave the half-humans, while the moderates pushed for a full-on alliance with them. When they pointed out how many enemies were flooding the capital, the commander only smirked. She took command because she was the strongest in the whole kingdom, and she vowed to crush every single one who dared stand against them. Aki stared into the truth and realized that even if he had the strength edge, victory still wouldn't come easy. The commander clamped down on his forearm, barking that he mustn't hesitate, hit back the moment he takes a blow. The real trouble was the moderate faction. There weren't enough empty promises to build a bridge between the races. Even the elves in the room got it. Those friendly kingdom forces weren't here to play nice. They were just waiting to snatch up every advantage of the alliance first. For ordinary mortals, elves were the ultimate fantasy. Promise after promise of crazy wealth, mind-blowing tech nobody had ever seen, and beauty so unreal it left people breathless. The commander snapped that, soon enough, the aristocrats and royal nobility would start hunting him down for their own secret deals, and the battlefield would be pure, brutal mind games. His heartfelt vow to save every single person he met sent the girls into full panic, because he didn't even bother to listen to a single word they were saying. The elder elf just smiled warmly in silence, watching the whole argument like it was unfolding just for him. Because that little demon had zero brakes, he jabbed the boy with his finger, then burst into merry laughter, rubbing it in like he was nothing but a fool. The elf girl snapped with pure irritation, saying this soft-hearted boy was utterly hopeless and, left unsupervised, he'd get robbed down to the last coin. Aki stood there, silent as stone, while the knight Hina loomed beside her. Lady Sheila beamed at the guests and praised their kind hearts and rare strength as the perfect gift for the woodland people. The moment those heartfelt words hit her, the knightess snapped into tense, ready for battle mode. Her eyes snapped wide with a sudden, shocking realization. With a no-nonsense vow, they promised to take full responsibility for the danger hanging over the elven people. Kina dropped to her knees the instant she stood before the governor. Staring straight into her, she swore with burning conviction, on her honor as a knight, that she would protect the elves no matter what. Aki flashed a warm smile, and for everyone else, the tension finally cracked, letting them breathe out in relief. Kina declared she'd sprint straight back to the royal capital right away, ready to start fortifying the defenses long before the ruler even shows up. Anxiety returned, and you could see it carved into the friends' faces all over again. Suddenly, a terrified elf messenger crashed into the room, shaking with panic, screaming the ruler's name at the top of his lungs. The boy felt the protective barrier shudder under the outright hostility, and he could tell the kid was right. This squeeze was weaker than the one before. The second the prediction hit, it was already done. Human squads sprinted off straight for the elven settlement. A colossal human army, clad in heavy steel armor, stood packed in the forest thicket, readying themselves to unleash an all-out attack. The brother narrowed his eyes with a dismissive smirk, acting like nothing could ever touch his superiority. Aki trudged back to the elf, swallowed her pride, and offered a quiet apology, saying it was nothing more than the usual fight between brothers. Aki's eyes turned deathly calm, steady, locked, and impossible to break. He made a quiet promise to crush it fast, no delays, no hesitation. Meanwhile, the enemy army, steered by the brother, barreled down the forest trail straight toward the peaceful settlement. The older brother flashed a sneaky grin, already tasting the sweet win he swore would be effortless. A sharp snap of a step shattered the forest's silence. Jill grinned and told him, "With your dad this worried, the rumors about elves in this forest have to be real." The fighters tightened their grips on their weapons in complete silence. One of the warriors fidgeted and blurted to Jill, asking if they should hold back and wait for the head of the family's orders first. Jill's fury snapped the moment she heard it, so she barked for silence right there, demanding they shut up. Then he even threw his status around, reminding everyone he was the future head of the family and ordering them to obey. Jill stared into the thick, looming trees, baffled by her father's over-the-top caution. She just wanted to snatch all the glory from the discovery for herself as soon as humanly possible. Back behind them, the soldiers huddled and whispered, replaying the Lord's strict secrecy order and that brutal warning to stay cautious the moment contact happened. When Jill flashed that predatory grin, the warriors' hearts sank. They knew he was about to grab the elves by raw force. The fighters traded hushed rumors about the elves' brutal magic, then dread swallowed the room, until a scout's sudden shout shattered their anxious whispers. Jill's face cracked into a satisfied grin the moment she heard the news, already tasting her triumph. The fighters' report tore through the forest like thunder. Yeah, they really did find creatures that looked just like the legendary elves. Jill's eyes burned with greedy hunger, and once the last obstacles vanished, he snapped into action, crushing the elves, flattering the capital, and seizing total power in the family. Jill stood there with her hands on her hips, glaring like she'd been waiting forever. He blurted out right away, demanding to know if the elf maidens were truly the unwritten beauties everyone raved about, yet the flustered fighter could only stammer that they kept their distance, so he never got a clear look at their faces. Jill pushed through the forest thickets, smirking as he plodded, coldly, to hunt for a little fun with those immortal beauties. Jill kept a secret fantasy locked in his chest, to turn the captive girls into his own household pets. He snapped around, desperate to catch a glimpse of that brazen troublemaker. From the thicket, Aki slipped out with calm confidence, and with a deadpan twist, he said his little brother was exactly the same as ever. Jill's guards froze in terror, staring at the boy and realizing he was the older gentleman everyone swore was dead. Sleepy Rin leaned out from behind him and couldn't stop wondering who that loud, noisy stranger really was. Jill's eyes widened as she snapped, raging at her brother, demanding to know why this random nobody was suddenly in the mix. A cheap shot was thrown, mocking him for looking way weaker than Aki, like the loudest screamer was the frailest. Rage surging through Jill, she tried to wrest control back and then blasted Aki with loud, ruthless mockery as a homeless outcast. From the thicket, armed elf maidens slipped out without a sound, their cold, serious stares screaming trouble for the enemies. Aki barked orders for the girls to hide behind him, but those fierce beauties stood their ground and refused to abandon their protector. A sick flash of the past ripped through Aki's mind. Jill once yanked him up and smashed his face straight into a plate of food with a filthy boot. Jill screamed with pure rage, claiming the elves and the whole estate were his, and that Aki would have to crawl on his knees for the rest of his days. He was practically choking on his own scream, swearing he'd crush his opponent and humiliate him completely. Aki cut right in, cool as ice, and said that tone won't get him anywhere. If Jill wants the elves' power, he'd better learn respect first. Jill shot Aki a furious eye roll and snapped that he was nothing but an annoying fool, someone who'd forgotten his place way too fast. Jill's patience snapped like a whip, and he barked at Aki to shut up, no lecturing him. A predatory grin cracked across his face, and he decided to corner the young man in a flashy display, just to scare the elves into submission. When they heard it, his own soldiers froze in pure shock, because Aki was unmistakably the eldest son of the House of Hinas, the rightful lord they'd been waiting for. But Jill wouldn't let that slow him down. He shrugged it off, said the man was a dead man either way, and then ordered his crew to go finish him. One of the warriors froze for a heartbeat, insisting they should check in with the leader first, but Jill didn't even think twice. She snapped his throat open with a single, lightning-fast slash. Blood spilled as the soldier crumpled onto the grass, coughing out only one thing, the name of the man who killed him. The mad commander yanked the blood off his sword with contempt, spitting, "Every last worthless soul here has forgotten who they answer to." When he barked, "Shut up and attack right now," the other fighters shook with pure terror. The guards slammed into the fight with a loud shout, and behind it all the little elf girl squeezed her hands tight as she nervously asked Aki if he could take it on his own. With a single-eyed grin, the warrior stayed stone calm, slid her hand onto her sword's hilt, and knew this fight would be over before it even started. China tore into the enemy ranks like a whirlwind, sweeping fighters flying in every direction with one crushing strike as she fought to rein in her own overwhelming power. A blinding blade tore through the air like lightning. The boy watched the brawl unfold from behind, then calmly but sharply told his partner to swing with a little more care. The steel tore through the air, whistling like a scream. The girl narrowed her eyes like a hawk, trying to pin down the exact force behind that blow. A lightning-fast slash cut through the air. Sarah shot her hands forward and bathed the injured enemy in a gentle wave of magic, and the young man gasped out her name in pure shock. Sister Saris barked in rage as she stormed through the forest, furious at herself for helping some ordinary person she couldn't explain. The elf softly admitted she didn't have much power left, but promised she'd still always be able to heal. Saris just offered a soft smile, then calmly reminded him that someone else had saved her once, too. The rescued man finally let out a shaky sigh of relief, and Hina flashed a bright grin as she declared, "Good, now we can fight at half strength." The boy locked his eyes in, and his gaze hardened with unstoppable focus. He clenched his fists in front of him, jaw tight, bracing for a no-mercy showdown. Hina drew her blade with total confidence, a predatory grin curling across her lips. A blinding white flash ripped the darkness to shreds. He stared at his boots in total disbelief, and right beneath them, fresh green grass suddenly hissed with a sudden rustle. The boy's eyes popped wide with pure, wild astonishment. Dozens of knights lay dead at his feet, and beside him his armed companion stared around in stunned disbelief. From the heart of the forest village, where towering tree houses stood like guardians, a terrifying scream tore through the air. The pompous Lord Jill, so convinced he alone was the true heir of House Gainas, was screaming at his exiled half-brother like a man losing his mind. Now the noble heir was sprawled in the grass, ropes cinched tight around him, just like his guards. The girl with those nasty shark-like teeth barked out a merry laugh, and Aki just awkwardly sighed through her taunts. The light-haired elf clapped her hands over her ears as the captive screamed, stunned that anyone could be this arrogant while stuck in such a humiliating mess. That sneaky little rascal narrowed his eyes and drove the point home. This terrifying lord couldn't even land a single finger on Aki. Aki stepped forward with calm confidence and asked his half-brother straight up if he wanted more. The whole room went dead quiet, and that tense silence swallowed every sound. Blows flashed again. Aki snapped his guard up, fighting back with every strike, cursing the fact that landing hits without hurting anyone was brutal, and through clenched teeth he told his brother, "Just stop already." The bound knight roared in pure fury, blaming his humiliating loss on chance, while Rin only let out a disappointed sigh, because she'd been craving an even harsher beating. Aki let out a defeated sigh. Beating someone that weak didn't sit right with him at all. Back at home, Jill brutally ripped the life out of him, but now, even without Rin's spiritual cloak, that former tormentor's moves looked like they've been nailed in place, barely twitching at all. He clenched his fist and grinned, thinking, if I keep eating like this, what in the world could I pull off? In that elven village, the plants weren't just pretty, they were pure wonder, stealing the spotlight from even the world tree's own leaves. Meanwhile, those elf maidens shot stern questions at each other about what to do with the captive. Then one of them coldly suggested handing him straight to the monsters. The boy stared it down, knew he couldn't just let the attacker walk away, and decided to rattle him just a little. He strode up to the tied trio and, with sharp, careful words, laid out the different ways they could pull this off. He calmly told me this wasn't some normal settlement at all. It was an elf-only closed territory, and anyone outside their line would be hit with savage punishment. The moment the despised exile spat his name, rage surged through the night like fire. When Aki warned them that their entire noble house was in danger, Jill only snapped back in rage, refusing to believe a word of it. Panic hit Jill, and she started screaming that his future lord status was doomed, and that the royal knights he'd insult would come for revenge for sure. He flashed a crazed grin, bragged that the elite knights would torch the whole forest to the ground, and dismissed his defeat as just a coincidence. The bound young man flashed a bold grin at Aki, and snapped that a nobody like her could never grasp his master plan. Aki hurried over to calm his companion, swearing the kingdom wouldn't kick off a war over something so stupid, yet the elf still couldn't wrap her head around human madness. The poor captured guardsman just trembled with terror, because this whole scene could have been spun as a ruthless kidnapping of a nobleman's son in no time. That arrogant scoundrel was loudly screeching like he owned tomorrow, claiming he'd be the future ruler of the House of Genus, and the only law in these lands, while the elf girl just sighed, utterly worn out. The girl's voice broke as she admitted the truth always gets rewritten by the people on top, because even Aki's exile was officially sold as nothing more than a death in the thicket. The air erupted into laughter, scoffing, "Who's going to believe a worthless outcast and a few forest elves?" But Aki stayed calm and said, cool as ice, that things were already in their hands now. At that exact moment, a girl knight in shining armor slipped out from the tangled trees, her silhouette hanging silently in the air. The frightened boy blurted out that he wanted a name, but Hina only sighed, sad as she shook her head, saying Lord Ginas had finally snapped for kicking out respectable Aki and bringing in this fool instead. The warrior snapped her sword out and barked at the captive to shut up, because every scream was another slap in the face to all of humankind. With an icy snap, she told him he was dead wrong to think he was untouchable, just because he dressed like an aristocrat. Rage burned in the captive as he lost control, screaming that he was the great ruler of the borderland's son and the most important man in all these lands. He kept screaming at full volume just to make sure nobody lumped him in with that weakling. The knightess snapped out a dry summary. That title for an unrecognized heir meant nothing. Dropping it was as easy as pie. The bound heir of the Ginas house erupted in furious screams, demanding obedience and waving his noble bloodline like a weapon. But the commander of the first knightly order in the capital stared him down and calmly asked the question that cut like a blade. Would the king believe her or that arrogant nobleman? She taunted him, questioning whether her face was so easy to miss that his own dog's barking couldn't even point her out. And that question hit him hard, freezing him with sudden, shocked understanding. The knight snapped her finger at the armed elves and warned that this reckless strike on the kingdom's allies is a grave crime, then vowed she'd report it to the ruler right away. Spinning toward Elder Sheila, the commander sank into a deep bow and offered a heartfelt apology, taking full responsibility for the shameful actions of her own companions. The young man could only choke on air, soaked in cold sweat as the truth hit. His high title meant nothing anymore. As the culprit slumped in the grass, the commander vowed to keep the elves' report under her control, and then pushed for an official meeting later. Rin ripped into the knight's pompous claim that he'd take full responsibility for the report, then mocked him right back. She snapped her head toward Hina and shot back, all sarcasm, that pretending to be a tough knight was fine, just not at the cost of shattering the protective barrier. Old elf Sheila stepped in slowly, her voice soft, trying to soothe the argument before it exploded. That tiny elf kept grumbling that keeping the village safe from monsters was a total headache, and fixing the defenses was somehow an even bigger one. Sheila flashed a warm smile and thanked Kini from the heart because that knight had stood guard over the village and nobody got hurt. "Miss Sheila," Kin blurted, then shattered into tears, full-on sobs of pure, bone-deep relief. As Sheila held that crying knight close, Aki snapped the mood into focus. This wasn't something he could handle alone. He had to bring it to his family and the kingdom. He told us the father's already hunting down the elven village, and that blasted broken barrier has to be repaired right away. Rin lit up at the thought of negotiations and marched forward, confidently hauling the prisoner, still bound hand and foot, right into the talks. The elder's daughter leaned in and told me her mom pulls her mana straight from the world tree. Sheila checked the majestic tree, fully healed now, and promised to back it up with her own magic without hesitation. Nieto could feel it in his bones. Divine power was pouring out of Sheila, the world tree's leaf that had once been eaten, and now it was roaring back to life. Saras raged at Aki, blasting him with accusations of perversion just because her mom was beautiful, and the poor guy only stammered in fear, swearing he hadn't even thought about it. She snapped that he should stop staring right now, and Aki shot his hands up, totally baffled. She stomped her foot and pouted at her mom, swearing she wasn't making things up. Then her mother just smiled quietly, like she'd already heard it all. From her window, the elder snapped that she couldn't show up to the meeting in the human kingdom. She had to keep the protective barrier up and running. She didn't send herself. She shoved her daughters in her place, Sarasa and Nieto. Aki didn't buy that idea at all. He pushed that they should call the kingdom's ambassador straight here, and it left both sisters reeling in shock. She smiled softly, then warned them. Once the barrier was back up, every ill-wisher would be swallowed for good in the thicket, so no giant delegation would ever make it through. Aki admitted you could get hopelessly lost in these thickets even without magic, and right beside him they all gasped, staring in awe at the sheer power of the elven protection. Before he could even suck in a breath, the boy got swept into the warm, protective arms of the mistress of the forest. Offended, Sarah struggled in silence as someone gripped her hand hard, stopping her from lunging at him. She wrapped him in a soft embrace, cheeks blazing red as a lobster, and murmured that the tree of the world would light his path, because at this point, he'd already been accepted as one of their own. The elf girl snapped back to screaming at Aki again about the hugs, but the moment it hit her, her face went hot. Then she stammered that they'd definitely get home together. Saras couldn't shake the fear that Nieto wasn't ready to face the people, especially after her sister had promised, with absolute certainty, never to step outside their home village again. The elder let out a mysterious chuckle, while the frowning Nieto snapped her mother's name through her clenched teeth. Saras helplessly shrugged, like, what choice did we even have? But her little sister was trembling with far worse fear for her. At the end, Aki laid it all out, his future crew, himself, Saras, Nieto, and the knight Hina, while the others nearby kept trading jokes non-stop, just to keep the spirit from taking anyone else. But Hina couldn't leave yet. She had to escort those bound prisoners first and deliver them straight to the royal capital. As the knight waited for her squad, a tiny elf with a cruel grin maliciously prodded the bound prisoner with a stick. Meanwhile, the hero was piecing together how those royal soldiers somehow cracked their way into the elven village, an impregnable fortress that everyone swore was untouchable. The boy's thoughts got smashed by a sudden street shout, but the knightess stepped in fast. Calm voices assured everyone and said her assistant Marvel is always right by her side. Deputy Marvel burst out from behind the bushes, bearded, helmeted, and full of good cheer, flinging his arms wide as he yelled that they'd finally found her. Behind him, a cart clattered along, carrying a monstrous forest beast's dead body, tongue lolling out like it was still screaming. The boy from Saras froze in shock at the window, instantly figuring out exactly who the knights had dragged in. The elf couldn't wrap his head around it. An ordinary person had just dropped a monster with one blow, and somehow, by accident, knocked the village's protective barrier right out of place. It was the legendary Gristle, the terror called the Scourge of the Forest, and it was moments away from ripping awake after a brutal, years-long sleep. Hina confessed with guilt that she'd gladly hand the beast to the local hunters if only she didn't have to drag it before the king first, as proof she finished the mission. Instead, they were practically handed a whole pile of smaller monsters the squad had already crushed on the way here. They pushed the idea of handing the loot straight to the village, and the elves nearly broke down in tears at that kind of generosity. She burst into carefree, sincere laughter, while everyone else slowly realized just how deadly this girl truly was. The elven settlement stunned everyone with its beauty. Tiny, cozy homes were tucked straight into the trunks of massive, ancient trees. One knight couldn't wait and blurted out that he wanted to stay with the locals for a cultural exchange, but the commander snapped at him to turn around and get back to the capital, right now. Right before they split ways, Hina the warrior pressed a special scroll into Aki's hands, one that let him reach her fast from the capital. She leaned in and demanded they read the second page closely, because that's where the names of the capital's big-shot nobles were printed, all ready to help. The tied-up robbers were yanked into the carts in a flash. Hina beamed at them with a warm farewell, wished them nothing but success, and the whole squad finally tore off on the road back. The moment the carriages vanished from sight, Rin let out a sharp, relieved sigh, annoyed, like she'd been holding it in, while Aki felt the girls had somehow stuck even closer by the end. Aki still couldn't wrap her head around it. This brand new acquaintance was secretly running an entire order of knights. While Rin grumbled, the boy couldn't shake the thought. If that stern knight had stayed, she'd have been too disciplined to act so spoiled. The boy let out a heavy sigh and pushed everyone to huddle up. Then he snapped straight to his companions and demanded to know if they could actually handle the brutal trek to the capital on foot. Then all I got were messy excuses. Turns out both of them had never even stepped outside their homes, and they knew next to nothing about the real world. Like true greenhouse flowers, shocked they'd just started their very first long journey. The blonde elf leaned in and asked whether Hina's letter hid any clue about the road. Then the guy suddenly remembered the scroll clenched in his hands. The young man snapped open the long scroll in a flash, and there it was, a list of rock-solid nobles, the real deal. That quick glance instantly dragged me back to the mention of Count Finis's house. The exact name that got thrown around was Count Luis. The boy went completely still, frozen by pure shock. When they asked if he knew this nobleman, the young man gave a quick nod. He recognized him, but it still felt wild seeing his name pop up among people they trusted. The young man remembered running into this aristocrat at those wild, lavish receptions. Her blonde eyebrows shot up in instant shock. The young man snapped that this guy is no ordinary troublemaker. He's a rare, top-tier scoundrel. The ponytailed girl practically sprang onto the boy's shoulders, yanked the paper out of his hands, and snapped, "Show me the list, right now." Then right in front of them loomed a smug, ancient rich man, so desperate to look powerful, he was ready to grovel to any authority. The short-haired elf girl scanned the document, frowned, and demanded, "Who's Felina?" And the boy shot back, "She's the Count's daughter." The inscription screamed that this letter was meant for the girl alone, not for her scandalous father. He remembered spotting the nobleman's daughter at those fancy parties, and somehow she never left him with a good vibe. Even though her friends questioned her sincerity, Felina still ended up at the top of the list as the most reliable assistant. The boy couldn't help thinking Felina acted like a real aristocrat, and it only made his view of her father grow darker. No choice remained, time to hit the road. Aki couldn't believe Hina would lie, but with his strength barely holding up, he knew any detour ahead could spell disaster. A sudden punch of sound tore through the silence. Papers exploded onto the table, and someone snapped that these reports were totally, completely pointless. Felina snapped, crossed her arms tight, and accused her assistant of hand-feeding her the same boring rundown of outdated books. Her eyes slitted into a razor-thin pupil, and that soft, questioning whisper, demanding justification, sent a chill through the whole room, like even the air stopped moving. She snapped, demanded they redo everything from the ground up, then spun toward the window, ignoring every terrified servant's apology. He only managed a shaky, fearful denial, trembling like his courage was about to snap. With his heart pounding, the assistant finally mustered the nerve to ask why she needed all those detailed facts about half-humans in the first place. He shot an icy glance over his shoulder instead of giving an answer. The assistant blurted out in sheer panic that he'd get everything ready right now, but the girl only let out a tired sigh. He only managed a strangled squeak of terror as he sprinted. The moment the door shut, Felina crumpled onto the sofa and muttered, "This is catastrophically not enough." Clutching her eyes shut with one trembling hand, she fought back tears as the truth hit hard. She had zero power to change a thing, no political pull, no money, and not even the strength to stand her ground physically. She gripped the yellowed sheet covered in rune and elf drawings, swore she'd dig up every scrap of knowledge she could, because if she didn't, she'd never be able to protect the people she loved. The leaves hissed in the wind, and the boy snapped his head up. His eyes went wide, mouth hanging open in pure shock. At the driver's loud, joyful shout, the cart tore through the forest path, whipping past towering trees, and the whole crew collectively held their breath, bracing for the wild ride ahead. In the enchanted forest, the trees obediently split apart, making a clear path for the cart to roll through. Aki couldn't help but marvel at what his companions could do, and he was pretty sure it was all Saras and Nieto behind it. Even though the elf girls were only a bit uncertain, they calmed the panicked boy and promised with total confidence that they would not miss Count Luis's massive estate. Malarin beamed and urged the horse on, and somehow it obeyed her instantly, no questions asked. Don't stress about getting lost. Hina goes full MVP and packs their supplies into big, whole bags. Saras told him their people speak through spirits, and she dared the boy to try forging that same connection, too. Still another elf couldn't shake her worry. She demanded to know if it was actually okay to bolt before she'd even settled things with her family, especially that wild brother of hers. The boy clocked every bit of the chaos tearing through his home right this second. But Hina barreled straight for the capital, buying time and stalling the news, while Jill, aggressive as ever, probably went off on her own. Cutting corners and coming back empty-handed would be pure stupidity, and Jill's unstoppable impunity will eventually corner him and force him to face his family. Gil's father and his brother were smart as lightning, and that worry hung in the air. But when it came to fighting strength, they still couldn't measure up to Gil. Rin snapped, furious, that this psycho is Aki's real biological brother, and she's sure he's about to pull something incredibly stupid. Aki shot a cold glance at the little one, then quietly decided to hand her to Hina as a plush for hugs. Staring at this total wreck and hearing Rin whine again, the elf just let out a heavy, resigned sigh, already convinced they might not even survive intact. The elf girl dropped her gaze and whispered that her people have to stay hidden. Humans are cruel, unpredictable, and ruthless enough to make safety impossible. The boy slowly laid his hand on her head, and the startled girl jerked back in shock. The young man leaned in and promised her, with a warm grin, that everything would be okay from this moment on. And right beside the elves, Kina towered, crushingly powerful, and the young man had gotten a huge power-up too, after devouring a leaf from the world tree. The girl swore that not a single one of her relatives would ever cross Sheila's barrier, one she and Rin had reinforced with spirit magic before they even touched the road. The little toothy assistant beamed and happily confirmed that her loyal minions were keeping a sharp eye on the protective dome. The elf shot back with a smug remark that even a slightly faded great spirit was still a great spirit, and Rin instantly blew a gasket. Rage boiled in Rin as she shook her offender hard, snarling that she wasn't spoiled one bit, while the other girl swatted her away and insisted it was just a figurative thing. While the girls clashed loudly in the back, their cart charged on, boldly steering straight for Count Luis's land. Right on cue, a grand estate belonging to the Count rose on the horizon like a promise. The Count leaned in, eyes sharp, and pored over the fresh papers like they held secrets. Things in his lands went from bad to worse, fast. The assistant swore that traveling merchants and adventurers are getting picked off one by some unknown killers. A fresh report says the cleared goblin lair outside the county is now occupied by a loud, bold crew of robbers who've just moved in. Duke Luis rubbed his temple tiredly after the report, and with a storm of hidden anxiety he demanded news about his daughter. The assistant said that the young lady had suddenly locked on to half-humans, especially elves. For days, the girl stayed planted in the office, trapped in a sea of ancient scrolls and dusty books stacked everywhere around her. The Count suddenly grilled his assistant about how he truly felt toward half-humans, and the poor guy snapped, flinching hard in shock. The kingdom had long dreamed of forging bonds with the elves, and now, after the knightly order was mobilized, each passing day made the chance of finally tracking down their settlements feel closer than ever. Even the ruler himself still saw elves as nothing more than childhood bedtime legends, pure fairy tale magic he wouldn't mind chatting with. Fingertip drum on the papers, the Count smirked. Ordinary folks can't pay for thoughts this trivial. Rulers have to plan every move and spot every threat that could explode if two different races ever clash. His stare sharpened into something harsher, like it could cut through anything. He honestly wondered if his daughter truly understood every political danger and consequence her choices could unleash. After he piled all the papers into one neat stack, the Count snapped his order, "Hand them to Fellini right away." The assistant snatched up the papers in shock, while his lord stared into the distance and silently decided, if his daughter's dreams could buy peace for their lands, he'd back them. From this moment on, every single outcome of this venture was now hanging on the young lady's next move. She slumped over her desk, buried in papers, while a brutal ultimatum bore down on her. One slip, no results, and she'd lose everything. The family head ordered the girl to be told this. If she failed, the clan's next leader title would be snapped up by her younger brother Milt right away. The day kicked off way too peacefully. Two elf maidens strolled the forest, soaking up the kind of calm that feels almost too good to be real. Then the perfect little idol got wrecked in one brutal moment. The carriage was shattered to pieces. Just a year ago, restless Rin was tearing across the land on horseback at full speed, cackling with joy and brushing off every warning her companions threw at her. She shot back, confident and unshakable that she had everything under control. The wheel slammed into a stone, and boom, both the cart and every passenger launched into a terrifying, never-ending tumble through the air. Even the local horned rabbits gawked in stunned silence at the absolute chaos. Luckily, nobody got hurt, so the boy quickly stashed everything away in a magical storage. Rin cringed, guilt burning hot as the reproaches rained down on her. The elf girls marched right up to the young man and chewed him out for spoiling his restless companion way too much. A desperate scream tore through the forest silence like it couldn't wait another second. A terrified knight in battered armor stumbled out of the thicket, like something was chasing him on the edge of sight. Gasping for air, he blurted out a warning about the danger creeping toward that poor lady. The moment he glanced down, that familiar emblem on his chest hit him like a spark. The knight shot out his hands in pure panic, begging for help, but the young man stepped between the girls and snapped into alert mode. The news hit like thunder out of nowhere. Lady Felina had been snatched by bandits. Their hideout sank deep in the shadowy mountain caves, swallowed by gloom. The robbers smirked with dirty confidence, like they couldn't believe they'd snagged the Count's daughter that easily. One of them snapped his eyes onto the captive like he couldn't wait to take everything. That girl stood there like she owned the room, proud, icy, untouchable, and the kidnappers didn't dare lay a single finger on her because their leader had ordered them to keep her beauty pristine for sale. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the main character clocked the House Louis coat of arms on the wounded knight's armor, and his mind raced to figure out why anyone would pull off such a reckless crime. The warrior couldn't stop gushing how the lady marched with a punitive squad, then traded her own freedom to save the life of her captured soldier. The heroes finally caught on. The captive really was Felina, and they'd been rushing her along just to reach her. She charged straight into the enemy's grasp without even a second of doubt. When those real elves showed up, the rescued knight went wide-eyed in disbelief, but the girls eyed him with sharp suspicion. The moment the boy heard there was a great spirit lurking somewhere, shock slammed into him so hard he almost blacked out. The tiny spirit spun through the air with pure joy, bragging loud about how unbeatable it was. But right now, everything else didn't matter. She needed rescuing, and she needed it fast. The boy scratched his head, panicking. He'd completely forgotten to hide Saras and the others. Then the knight snapped into recognition as the heir of the Genas house, and the boy calmly told him, "Yeah, I'm already the former one." He couldn't waste a second. He snapped straight into action and demanded every detail, how many bandits there were and exactly where they were keeping the captive hidden. In his mind, a horrifying vision exploded. Beautiful Lady Felina, now bound and helpless inside a filthy villain den. Those thoughts hit, and Elf Saras choked back an anxious sigh, while the poor warrior snapped, screaming in despair, clutching his head, cursing his own weakness, until the little half-beast couldn't stand it anymore. He tried to talk himself into it, insisting those robbers wouldn't hurt the Count's daughter since they were banking on a massive ransom, or selling her to slave traders. But Saras snapped it all down, refusing to hear another word and demanding action right now. When they asked what happened to the other soldiers, the knight snapped that they'd rushed back to the estate for reinforcements, and that's why he'd been sent out, to find any battle-tested adventurers nearby. When the conductor blurted in shock, asking why the Genas house heir was traveling unguarded, he just smiled coolly and said, "Relax, I'm only a former heir." The warrior's face lit up with real hope the moment the boy agreed to help, and then he barked, "Take me straight to the kidnapper's camp." Then he stepped forward with total confidence, swore he'd personally crush any soldier from his old family, and that shocked the poor, confused leader into pure disbelief. As he grabbed the horse and got ready to bolt, a cold suspicion hit him. Felina, the one Hina warned about, was way too smart to let herself get taken without a plan lurking behind it. The road spit them out at a lair, an ugly, dark crevice in the rock, propped up by a heavy, bristling palisade. A brutal, heavy step snapped his thoughts in half, and then a knee slammed onto the dusty forest path with a loud thud. It was a wild, brutally dangerous game, but there was literally no other way out. She planted herself, unshaken, right in the middle of those scattered bandits inside the cave, grinning, because this time she had the power to handle them all solo. She slid the blade back into its sheath with a soft clink, and then it hit her. She finally knew which merchant had been yanking the bandits' strings in secret. Ahead, the clock is merciless. Can her own people sprint in time, or will these fresh thugs beat them to the punch? She flashed a confident smile and slipped into yet another reckless gamble. The knight cautiously checked the road was the right one, even though he couldn't wrap his head around why it was steering them down this strange path. The red-haired spirit girl erupted in joyful laughter and waved everyone along, dragging them forward with pure excitement as they rode the journey together. The warrior even tried to spark outrage, snapping that the legendary Great Spirit was just an ordinary dog, but the whole company was so chill that no one was buying into the fight. The squad finally hit their destination, and right in front of them, a dark, creepy cave entrance swallowed the path, tucked behind thick, tangled foliage. The heroes dropped into the bushes without a sound, staring hard at the lair while the dead quiet air screamed danger. Aki leaned in and hissed at his crew to cover their ears. Then, right as the operation started, Saras the elf snatched up her hood. The knight figured that at least 10 of those 36 bandits had to still be crammed inside the lair deep down. She erupted in laughter, calling the robbers bears, then dove straight into the darkness, while the boy could only shout after her, helpless. The conductor bolted under the stone arch first and yelled at Aki in shock, spotting the bodies sprawled on the ground. The knight's dream of finding the missing girl crumbled the moment Aki said all they'd found was an old man lying there. The floor was littered with bodies, and there were way more than just a few. Suddenly, heels clattered like thunder in the shadows, and the mysterious woman smiled. Her wild gamble finally paid off. The elf maidens froze in shock, trying to wrap their minds around how those brutal bandits ended up crumpled on the floor, completely helpless. When the worried outburst hit the air, Lady Felina just spun around with a confident grin and calmly told them, "I said I'd handle it myself." She stood tall with her arms crossed, blazing with confidence as lush roses framed her like a throne. Leaves above them whispered and rustled like the forest was holding its breath. The tiny elf in the hood stumbled through his first word, whispering it like it might betray him. The boy and the tiny elf jumped in shock. When she spoke, it sounded like raw insanity, and the elf, under his breath, warned them about these people. She eagerly spilled the whole truth. She deliberately surrendered, gathered the info she needed, and then wiped out a dozen bandits all by herself, and her knight proudly backed up every word. The lady waved it all off, swore she had zero strength, and admitted she'd never won a single training duel, leaving her burly defender utterly stunned. The dark-haired boy snapped to it and blurted, asking if the one who kept steamrolling her in those sparring matches wasn't actually Hina herself. The young man snapped to the truth. Her strength was shattered and fake, while the girl just shrugged and said she wouldn't survive even a minute against real professionals. The guard went ghost white at the mention of the legendary leader of the Second Knightly Order, only for the young man to calmly grin and say it was just his childhood friend. Aki replayed the rumors. People weren't just dazzled by Felina Louis's beauty, they feared how sharp her political instincts were and how deadly her talent could be. When the young man blurted, stunned, "Where did you even learn that?" the lady stayed cool and said, "Relax, our lands touch, and I know the nobility register by heart." Her voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "So tell me, what kind of heir from a noble bloodline is doing out here in this backwater?" She was totally stunned. This future lord was roaming around almost without any escort at all. She suddenly felt a surge of mana slam through her. Then she snapped around, holding her breath like a dare. Real forest elves stood right behind them, watching like they'd already been waiting for this moment. She stared in shock, like her own eyes were lying to her. Malarin snapped her hands up in fury, demanding everyone's eyes on her. While he tried to defend himself, she snapped from the ignoring, and Rin kept losing it with non-stop screaming. She figured the Gina's clan had already locked in a secret alliance with them for ages. The boy fumbled through his confession about getting exiled, and the elf snapped back that their whole clan is an enemy to them. This left the girl totally baffled. Then he leaned in and told me the wild story of how he stumbled into the forest and met a monster, only to realize it was a spirit named Rin. From the belly of the fallen creature, the elf Ceres, he swore, came crawling out, and the second she did, she turned bright red and begged him to never bring it up again. He casually mentioned that the elf maidens would tag along with him, and it instantly sparked fury in Ceres. The girl finally got it. Those forest people don't trust the great clan at all. They trust this boy because he earned it personally. She just snatched her own head from all that endless news overload. Hope lit up his face as she was declared the one future ally he'd come to rely on above all others. She brought up Hina and swore that Hina ended up in Lewis's hands exactly because of her advice. Hearing that, the guy leaned in and quietly asked her, "So you really dated Hina?" Right in the middle of the talk, the guy barked for Rin to come closer and snapped everyone's attention with a sharp warning. An ambush was coming. From the thicket, a rough, hoarse laugh burst out, and the stranger smiled like he'd just won, saying the prey was way more valuable than anyone ever promised him. The bushes around them rustled like something was lurking, waiting to strike. Swords blazing, the bandits burst out of the forest at once, snapping into a tight ring around the squad and cutting off every escape route. The one-eyed brute with a giant axe on his shoulder surged forward, flashed a hungry grin, and barked that the captives were too restless. The bandit bragged that he'd beat them into submission, but the heroes were already locked in, ready to fight back with a real, hard-earned resistance. A monstrous giant with a colossal axe perched on his shoulder stepped in front of them, gave a chilling grin, and promised he'd shut down the two loud travelers fast. Felina's face drained of color as terror seized her, because she'd just clocked the bandit's notorious name, and she never, ever thought she'd meet him in this backwoods forest. Aki calmly ordered Rin to get ready for battle, and the goofy little spirit perched on his head squealed with thrilled agreement. Frightened Felina burst into screams, pleading with the guy not to go looking for trouble. But Aki shut his eyes, and the very next second, a blazing magical aura exploded around him, spinning into a roaring whirlwind. Felina and her knight companion went wide-eyed when they realized the boy had actually managed to wear a spirit's aura like it belonged to him. Gaburo smirked like he owned the world and barked at his men to lay off the girl because she'd sell for a fortune at the slave market. Felina leaned in and demanded to know, does he even have a clue who he's about to face? She yanked Aki by the sleeve, stunned he'd actually go through with it. Then he just stayed calm and told her the bandits begged for a fight themselves. Felina blurted it out, shaking with urgency. This scar and that giant axe were left by a past adventurer who secretly toppled the bandits' leader and then stole the crown. Meet Gaburo the Bloody Flame, once the stuff of legends, the guy who took down a giant dragon all by himself. Aki let out a sharp eyes narrowing as he closely studied his opponent. Then the boy strode up to the gang with fearless confidence, leaving his worried friends in the dust. He tried to calm her down by reminding her just how unstoppable his spirit was. But the moment she panicked, she screamed that all their past wins were nothing more than luck that randomly hit, nothing to trust. The knightess in her armor stared at the young man in shock, then muttered that she felt zero danger from him, like he couldn't possibly be a threat. The boy smirked like it was nothing and told him that in the elven village, he had to haul out ordinary weeds by the tons. The girl gasped, fear slamming into her as she sensed the enemy closing in. From the bushes, a giant bandit with an axe exploded into view, cackling like a maniac as he swung for a killing strike. The tiny flower fairy perched on the boy's head erupted in a flash of dazzling magical light the moment she appeared. The weapon ripped from the giant's grip and hurtled away, and the brute just blinked like he couldn't believe what he'd lost. A heavy axe screamed through the air, then slammed into a tree trunk with a thunderous crack, bursting the wood into flying splinters. A blazing cellular wall snapped into place around the heroes, and the stunned kid finally witnessed the spirit's magic for himself, mana ripping out of thin air as if it had a heartbeat. Magical energy surged, roaring with fresh power. The toothy fairy flashed a huge grin, swearing she'd rain down even worse trouble on the enemy. In the very next instant, a brutal burst of power slammed the giant to the ground and hurled him deep into the thicket, where he tore through the air with terrified screams. With a brutal strike, he sent the bandits crashing to the ground, and dust clouds exploded around them like smoke. The young man stared at his palm, where the magic still crackled, and his tiny winged buddy burst into laughter. Then the boy finally got it. Compressing magic didn't just change it, it unlocked a whole bunch of new ways to fight. Suddenly, thick clay shackles tore up from the ground, and the stunned bandits snapped into treachery, charging in fast to grab the girls and use them as hostages. The clay shackles hit the mark, boom, snapping shut fast as they wrapped the attackers' legs and left them dangling upside down from the branches. The noble girl and her friends just froze, holding their breath as a shocking, unstoppable force slammed into them. But that bandit leader stayed upright, rage blazing in his chest, and yanked out his curved, serrated dagger with a blood-red stone set in the hilt. The axe he'd already hurled into a tree stayed stuck in the trunk, so the villain had no choice now but to go all in on brutal, close-quarters fighting. The man twisted into a hideous grin, death grip clenching his weapon as he braced to unleash a killing blow. He rasped that his blade was slick with a deadly poison, one that unleashes such brutal pain the wounded would claw for death. With a wild scream, the leader lunged into the fray, blade raised for the strike, yet the young man locked eyes with him and, cool as ice, warned him about poison. The leader flashed a cocky grin, certain the boy was just running the exact same trick again. Aki, with a calm grin, pointed out that he'd boosted his magic to a whole new level. Rin was already sprinting, shouting for them to do it all over again, exactly the way they'd done it before. At that exact moment, the earth lurched, and giant wooden piles blasted up with a fierce whistle. Aki jerked back, heart slamming. The whole group went wide-eyed and numb, because that boy somehow just flipped his magic on the spot and turned it straight into solid wooden spears. Deadly wooden spikes tore through the air like a sudden strike. The enemy leader backed into a dead end, hemmed in by a razor-sharp palisade, panicking as he clawed for any way out. The ruined bandit screamed in agony, clutched the dark amulet at his throat like a lifeline, and prayed it would save him. Then a brutal, unbearable spasm ripped through his body. He crumpled to the ground and convulsed right in front of his terrified partner. The boy stepped closer with steady calm, and he couldn't shake the question, where the hell did all that loud bragging, choose death courage go when real pain showed up? Seeing those brutal torments, Aki begged Rin to knock the bandit out, and Rin agreed without a second thought. The tiny spirit simply yawned in midair, and a weird, unsettling calm rolled over everything like a spell. The girl could only stare in shock, amazed that the boy showed mercy to the very enemy who had just tried to end him. A thunderous strike hit the robber out of nowhere, and he crumpled instantly, going straight down into a deep knockout. The first problem got solved, but my mind was still a chaotic, total wreck. The aristocrat narrowed her eyes, refusing to call it magic just because the enemy had dropped into a sleepy slumber. Even after hearing the whole thing again, she still wouldn't buy that nonsense for a second. As the knights bound the captured bandits, their commander stood there stunned, his head spinning from everything he'd just heard, like his thoughts were literally boiling. In the end, the lady looked him straight in the eye and called him completely abnormal, and he just shrugged it off with a tired reply. He'd say the same thing about her. First, he slammed 3 truths onto the table. Felina's chasing her own goals. She's hooked on elves and spirits, and crushing those bandits will win them clout and support from her powerful family. He dropped under the shade of a forest tree, ready to zero in on every single detail of her situation. He wrung his hands and asked if Count Luis would really back their plan, but Felina shot him a confident grin. Her father always keeps his word, no exceptions, while nearby little Rin just sat there, bored out of her mind. The young man nodded quietly, and right beside him one of the elven sisters clung tight to the puffed-up Rin, while her younger sister beamed, reminding everyone that she was the older one's twin. Felina let out an awkward sigh, and her proud, stern father's looming reputation instantly threw a ton of questions at her companion. The boy confessed he'd only heard about the ruler through rumors, and the girl shot back that it was the same for her, too. The real problem was the Viscount's sons, Gilly and Willem, because their father worshipped strength above all else, and that made them feel untouchable. She stared him down and straight up asked if he truly believed the window cleaner Heinez was honest after everything that went down. Felina crossed her arms and shot back, honestly, that nobody gets to call her father a saint either. When she said everyone sees him as a helpless failure, he could only force out an awkward smile. Still, Viscount Ginas ran his court with fairness, kept things peaceful with his neighbors, and always made the smart call when it counted. A real smile finally cracked across the boy's face. His first, dependable ally had arrived. The girl dropped onto the bench, plotting how to make contact with the neutral faction, yet the sheer size of what was coming still rattled them both. In front of them stretched a brutal road to the royal capital, and this exact step had been locked into their plan from the very start. The young man calmly sized up the whole mess, realizing one brutal truth. If this could be solved that easily, Hina would have handled it herself ages ago. Rin flashed that toothy grin and lit up like a kid again, because yes, they were riding in a carriage, and she demanded a seat right at the very front. Kina clenched her decision tight. She'd spill every last truth to her father first, and she flat out refused to hand the reins back to the spirit. Inside the company, it's a wild crew, an arrow-quick young heir with a mysterious gift, a loud, big spirit that won't shut up, and 2 elf maidens utterly lost and staring like, what is happening? The girl snapped a weary hand to her head as the little one fussed, almost crying, and demanded, like a tiny captain, that she get to steer the crew. Meanwhile, inside Hina's ancestral estate, locked behind those fancy walls, pressure built so hard it felt like everyone could barely breathe. In the office, the family's head stared straight ahead with a tight jaw, barely holding his rage in check. The walls rattled with his scream. He demanded to know why Jilla still hadn't been found. The guard slumped and reported that 30 soldiers, plus Gil, vanished without a trace somewhere deep in the forest thickets. The lord seethed at his eldest son's reckless dash into the forest, but Willem, his younger brother, stepped up and told him to cool off. With a smug grin, the little one bragged that Jill's strong and backed by help, so there's no way she'll get lost, unlike that useless loser of a brother. Willem kept throwing himself in front of his brother, but their father's rage just kept roaring louder and louder. The boy calmly spread his arms, like he was shielding his brother, but you could tell he was really trying to escape, with a little favor in the capital, at the elves' expense. He flashed a sweet smile, like a quiet warning. There still wasn't a single official word about the heir. The servant swore he'd keep searching, but Lord Gina snapped the talk short on the spot, saying there was nothing left to discuss until Jill came back. The lord stroked his mustache with sharp, thoughtful focus, like he was weighing a decision in silence. You watched his every move with a chill, ruthless calm. The old man sank into his chair and let out a heavy sigh, worn down by problem after problem that never seemed to end. Already in his head, the younger son was openly mocking Jill, saying that if he'd just stayed quiet after Aki's disappearance, the title would have practically landed in his lap. He clenched his fist, savoring the win as the memory replayed, watching that naive fool get pushed into action so effortlessly. A predatory grin curled on the boy's lips, like trouble getting ready to strike. He snapped on a worried face in an instant and, like nothing was wrong, cheerfully told his father, "I'll help you search." He figures a plain disappearance solves half the mess, but the other move could turn into a full-blown nightmare fast. The lord snapped his gaze up at him, stunned. Then he burst into a fiery monologue about wiping out the elves, claiming their conquest would rake in profits so massive they'd steamroll any legacy. That last hit against her father screams one thing. Jill's ready to flip on the Ginas, and only the younger brother can stop the fallout. A thick mustache man rubbed his chin, deep in thought, while a freckled blonde stood dead center of the giant hall like she owned the place. A shadow slid across the boy's face, and his lips twisted into a cold, sinister grin. He stood by the window, and when his daughter's soft voice slipped into the room, it yanked him out of his heavy, grinding thoughts. Felina Lewis strode into the office, dropped into a deep curtsy, and declared, "I'm back." Before long, the entire company crowded into the plush living room for tea, while Rena, completely shameless, crunched sweets right in front of the stunned count. The house's master took one quiet sip, then let out a heavy sigh, because at last, the whole situation clicked into place. He set the cup down, chose to speak straight, and realized the higher an aristocrat's title climbs, the better they mask their flaws. He was so stunned, he just stared, blown away by the Count's razor-sharp mind, the kind that snatches up everything in an instant. But a sharp doubt sparked in the boy's mind, because that kind of honest straightforwardness simply didn't fit the cold, strict reputation aristocrats had in society. The Count stumbled over his own words and admitted he didn't get half of that tangled mess, and Felina just sighed, like, "Yeah, I figured." The Count forced himself to breathe, then blurted that elves had always felt like a bedtime fairy tale, yet here they were in his living room, and it was Aki who had the real, strange link to them. As the guy awkwardly scratched the back of his head, Felina was left dead with horror, because Aki had absolutely no idea what kind of power he was holding. The tired Count slumped back on the sofa and let out a heavy sigh, because now he'd have to choose every word like it could kill, in front of a guest who held all the trump cards. As one of the girls calmly chewed through her cookie, the Count clocked the truth. When you're dealing with nobility and the royal family, bluffing isn't just useful, it's sometimes necessary. He studied the guest in silence, then snapped that Aki's power is way too lethal for underhand tricks, so all he has to do is recognize the one advantage only he can use. The elf leaned in and murmured that the Count was way nicer than anyone expected, and Aki just froze there, silent and awkward. Lord Louis drummed his fingers on the table and leaned in, asking Aki straight up what reward he wanted from the Louis house for his ties to the elves. But just as the talk was getting somewhere, little Rin burst in and screamed at the top of her lungs that she wanted a brand new carriage. Aki snapped her hand over the girl's mouth, but the girl kept thrashing and yelling that they needed a strong crew, not some busted one right there along the way. She was already picturing herself in charge of a massive carriage pulled by a whole team of horses, leaving the Lord and Felina gaping in stunned amazement. The Lord let out a smug laugh and swore he'd fund her carriages every single day, but Felina knew that even a grand house can't be raised on little promises like that. Aki finally swallowed his embarrassment and blurted out that he was heading straight to the royal capital, just to tell the truth about the fight with the forest inhabitants. He handed every crucial negotiation over to the elven reps, Sarasu and Nieto, while bound Jilla, destined to become the next head of the genus house, was already being dragged toward the capital. The Lord studied the guest inch by inch and clocked it instantly. This man wasn't driven by nothing. He just trained himself to lean only on his own power. He took a slow sip of his tea, then nodded like, yeah, Aki's strength is real, and it proves she can stand on her own with that proud independence. Aki used to be the genus family's weak heir, but now he stands before the Lord as a totally different man, like the past got left in the dust. Kicked out of his own home, the young man forged his way to the elves on his own, won their trust, and when Felina spoke, the Count realized one thing for sure. This kid wasn't just there to talk, he had real combat skills. The Lord leaned in and dropped his voice, because in the capital, the nobles are scrambling over elf and half-human connections, and every single person there is running their own cutthroat game. The little cup gave a gentle chime, then landed on the saucer like it had just struck a perfect note. While most nobles sat on the sidelines, radical conspirators were already simmering in the shadows, ready to snatch control of the half-people's lands by force. Aki pointed out that with a setup like that, the elves could hold off basically any military strike, at least to a good extent. Still, Count Louis and his son knew the real danger wasn't swords. It was politics and poison room schemes, and the Genus family definitely wouldn't just sit there and do nothing. The boy stammered out his thanks for the support, because their families had never crossed paths before. The Count swore he'd set up the info pipeline fast and shove Aki straight into the spotlight with the big shots in the capital. He wasted no time. He warned that those high and mighty nobles would never stop trying to dominate the elves, and that the boy's special power would be the key target. Aki clocked it instantly. The stuffy old aristocrat wasn't cold at all. He was weirdly kind, gentle, and genuinely caring toward Rin. Out of all the possible backers, the knight pointed to Commander Knight Hina because she'd already been waiting for them in the capital. But even Louisa's power and the grand title of Countess couldn't carry her through the court games. Then the Count snapped out the harshest truth of all. The kid is running so dry, he barely has a single ounce of gold. Felina's chest tightened as she realized sinlessness was the one crack elf hunters would hunt for. Aki immediately understood one brutal truth. Wealth was about to become his deadliest weapon. With a satisfied grin, the Count pointed to the one who'd crack this mess, Wenzel, the legendary merchant. The girl went rigid, eyes locked forward, and pure shock hit her like a punch. Felina snapped to her feet when the household's head said this opponent would be brutally hard to reach an agreement with. Her father snapped his decision in place. He sent his daughter Felina with that young man and swore she was the strongest weapon the House of Louis could ever hand over. A wall of thick steam rolled out of the hot spring, fogging the air and welcoming the guest like a living breath. Before anything could happen, the host urged the boy to settle in and soak his fatigue away in the healing water. Right then, a nervous voice called out from behind, and Aki startled so hard he practically jumped out of his skin. Heat flooded his face with embarrassment, his heart sprinting out of control, and he could barely breathe because the wild, classic hot spring spicy scenario was actually happening to him for real. The boy forced an awkward grin as he stared at the beauties who absolutely refused to cover up. Their loud laughter rang out like music, carefree and unstoppable, bouncing off every wall around them. One of the girls lazily kicked her slender leg out of the water, stretching with a happy, carefree sigh. A thick haze rolled over the huge bathhouse, and the whole crew sagged under the relentless heat. Suddenly, the girl let out a heavy sigh, slammed her palm to her forehead, and wrestled with the weight of serious memories. The elf maidens locked eyes with each other, fear creeping in, and then rushed to ask who in the world was this mysterious Mr. Wenzel. When the legendary merchant Wenzelga's name hit the air, everyone froze mid-breath for a split second. This sharp businessman built a massive trading empire from absolute scratch, and somehow pulled it off in just one single generation. The elf girl snapped her eyes wide in shock, stunned that someone this powerful would actually step up and say, "Yes, I'll be your ally." She plunged into the water until it lapped at her nostrils, and the words stuck. Her father himself had called Wenzelga a crucial partner for their house. Turns out this rich dude didn't start rich at all. He climbed up from ordinary adventuring, and his martial arts skills still hit like a truck. The lady admitted it straight up. The opponent wasn't going to be easy to beat. The girls basically agreed. Wenzelg has almost zero weaknesses, and his high status crushes any enemy's hope of even getting a win. She remembered her father's warning about the 3 pillars of power: military might, political influence, and financial authority. And this merchant had all 3, fully and without mercy. That quick flash of memory left her stranded. She kept running her hand through the water, because figuring out a way to deal with a negotiator this complicated felt utterly impossible. She fixed her gaze ahead, realizing one wrong move and there's no conversation at all. She snapped her head toward her companion and warned them. Elves were ridiculously rare in the human world. Everyone chased only what lined their own pockets. The young elf nervously blurted out that from everything they'd heard, her own kin sounded like the perfect trade goods. Powerful nobles are ready to pull any kind of trick they can think of to steal the legendary secrets of elven beauty, immortality, and ancient artifacts. As she stared down, she made a silent vow. She'd never let anyone use her like some convenient pawn again. Those words genuinely blindsided the young elf. Shaking off a brief weakness, the girl shot up out of the water because she had to grab intel on Wenzelga right now. A brutal wave slammed the Countess's daughter straight in the face, and she just let out a panicked quack of pure shock. A burst of crystal-clear laughter rang out, pure, innocent, and impossible to mistake. The elves went into pure panic when they realized their guest had crumpled, and now lay face down, completely helpless, right in the middle of the spring. Not far from there, Rin was splashing like crazy and yelling at Nieto to race, grinning at that massive pool, until she got met with a quick, firm refusal. A scorching blast of hot water suddenly tore through the quiet of the spring. That elf girl crinkled her nose in disgust, then snapped that everyone was already grown up and they needed to stop turning the whole place into a racket. The red-haired beast burst into a loud, ringing laugh, and it snapped the elf, she screamed, then charged straight at her, fists flying. Someone fought to smother a laugh as the others hovered with worry, grilling Felina. "Are you okay?" Watching Felina's antics, he burst into a warm, helpless laugh. Anxiety flickered in her eyes. How on earth could these girls laugh so freely, when their very existence could topple whole kingdoms? The elf girl flashed a warm smile and murmured, calm as moonlight, that they'd been saved by the one who sees no difference between humans and elves. One of the elf girls genuinely swore that Aki and fate would somehow click into place, while Felina shot her a skeptical look and demanded to know if that hope had any real proof behind it. She dropped her gaze and admitted, with a quiet honesty, that people don't always follow logic. Felina burst into playful laughter and said the hardest thing to read was Rin. In her head, she figured Wenzel and this strange girl both felt totally impossible to read. Hot water swallowed her worries as she sized up the odds, and then she grinned, because her chances weren't as bad as she thought, and a real fight was waiting just ahead. Facing an opponent far stronger, you'd better brace for danger and unleash your trump card right on the razor-thin edge of what might work. On her side already stood elves, a mighty spirit and the knight's commander, and best of all, a boy with insane strength who had no clue she was coming. If she played her cards right, she'd even outplay the great merchant, too. While she was busy plotting big dreams, the same young man was stuck in the next bath, awkward as hell, while that muscular giant hit him with confusing compliments. So he sat there begging in his head for someone to save him. Aki flashed an optimistic grin as he clutched a towering stack of papers, whipping and scattering around him like they were possessed. The young aristocrat dumped every scrap she'd managed to dig up about Lord Wenzel into the boy's hands and demanded it be memorized. Under that kind of pressure, the kid only had one option: obediently nod and comply. Duke Louis flashed pure confidence, swore he'd step in himself to negotiate with the big players, and set the whole stage to ensure their safety. The prince barked an order and sent his assistant to race a messenger ahead right now. As Aki silently thanked the count for his care, Felina grinned and swore she'd whip up the papers fast so Aki could move freely through the capital, for free. She honestly couldn't wrap her head around human bureaucracy and its endless paperwork, then shocked the boy with the truth. Her people don't use documents at all. Instead of magic spells flying around, the elves leaned on contracts, and the girl proved it instantly, snapping a glowing magical circle into existence right in front of everyone. That mystical vow carved itself into the very soul, passed through the generations, and had the mana itself watching to make sure it got fulfilled. She closed the distance, voice soft but unshakable, and reminded them that their bond was now stitched into their souls for good. With a soft, warm smile, the girl leaned in and told Aki that it's those unshatterable bonds that tie him straight to every elven soul. The young man spun around, and there stood Felina, right up close. She exhaled in pure enchantment, but her sentence died in her throat. The boy finally got how it worked, but fresh doubts started chewing at him. Was he really allowed to cash in on these benefits after reincarnating into a brand new body? Meanwhile, his young companion stared at the magic like it was a miracle, her shining eyes locked on every moment with pure awe. The girl couldn't hold it in. Pure mana hit her so hard she burst out, giddy, saying she'd never seen anything like it before. The boy lounged back on the sofa, flicked his fingers, and rattled off the complex spell again, so hard the terrified maid nearly sent the tray flying. Malarin practically bounced with joy, blurting that she wouldn't expect anything less from her childhood friend Hina. She snapped with indignation the second she realized he kept copying her, and the boy just shrugged it off, saying he could only do it because of the power he'd absorbed from her. And yeah, a great spirit is great for a reason. From the boy's gentle touch, she instantly snapped out of it. Then her cheeks flared red with a deep wave of embarrassment. Her friends warned her to quit the arrogance, but she only puffed out her cheeks, bristled at the insult, and demanded even more respect for her status. A little while later at the office, the young man bowed and thanked Count Louis for the official papers stamped with his personal seal, because those documents were going to make life in human society feel way easier. The Count let out a tired sigh and snapped that after all that dazzling contract magic, his paperwork suddenly felt totally pointless. That brave little girl scooted up to the table, leaned in, and stared at the official papers, hooked by the wild, whimsical scribbles like they were about to give up a secret. The man narrowed his eyes, then carefully lowered the huge feather into the ink like it mattered. The Count figured a diploma would barely matter out in the forest, then leaned in and asked if she wanted those letters. Louise wrote a few gorgeous letters on the paper, then leaned in and softly told the girl exactly how her name was spelled. He told her to kick things off by writing her own name, because he was sure it would come in handy later when she had to live and deal with people. She clutched the paper to her chest and breathed her name into the air like a spell. Lord Louis slammed the first documents onto the table and declared he was ready to give travelers every bit of help he could. Recommendation letters for Lord Venzelga and the documents proving their squad's official recognition landed on the table with a final, decisive thump. Felina pledged to her father, with steel in her voice, that she'd shoulder everything herself, and he answered, "Good, I'm counting on you." The trees whipped back and forth in the wind, and the boots stomped onto the crew's step with fearless confidence. The young elf girl let out a shaky breath, then leaned forward, peeking outside like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. From the hilltop, the travelers finally laid eyes on the majestic royal capital spread out below, all shimmering across the valley. Malarin planted her feet and swore she'd never, ever abandon her named crew. The friends jumped in, persuading the fussy girl that in a cramped city, a stroller would only slow them down. Felina's idea to leave it at the villa truly saved the day. The boy blurted, shocked, "Wait, are you telling me your family really owns a palace like this? Right here in the capital?" Felina narrowed her eyes and hissed a warning. The local predators would snap up that poor fool and devour him alive in no time. The young man fidgeted and scratched the back of his head, and it hit him hard just how huge the gap was between their worlds. The boy froze in stunned disbelief when he heard he'd become the only one the proud elves had ever truly respected. Felina looked the boy straight in the eye and told him what he truly meant, while their little companions stared after the carriage as tears spilled down their faces. While luxury mansions towered in the background, a warning cut through the air. Don't get fooled by small fortunes. People will line up in droves, begging to gift him an estate just for his favor. She snapped that when you meet the powerful, you'd better bluff with iron confidence, because only that way can you keep your friends safe. With the grand estate towering behind her, he praised Felina as kind-hearted in a soft voice. Boom! Embarrassment hit her instantly, and she shot back indignantly, yelling at him. Locking eyes with his intense stare, she swallowed hard and blurted out, "What happened?" Rubbing his cheek, he admitted she was right, and warned that if they ignored this, it would come back to hunt them later. The girl demanded, "Are you going to ride on my influential family's name?" And the boy grinned and swore he'd do the exact opposite. "He told me the capital still counts as an official member of the Guinness House." Meanwhile, deep in the dungeon, the young man crushed his hands around the iron bars in pure despair, knowing he was about to get dragged into the mess, and not alone. His imprisoned brother was caught in it too. His legs crumpled under him, and he tumbled helplessly onto the cold, unforgiving floor of the cell. They were talking about Gilginas, Aki's younger brother, a full-on sociopath who'd slaughtered an elven village until Hina finally stopped him, and now Shay was watching his every move, praying it was enough. Aki pounded on the door, and if Lord Venslig's meeting went bad, he promised himself he'd find Hina first. Felina let out a heavy sigh. Hina's strength is unreal, but she's totally clueless about politics, and that could land her in serious trouble fast. Her speech got cut short as the maid burst in. Someone demanded an immediate audience, and they didn't even bother with a herald. The moment she heard it, color drained from her face. The maid snapped out the guest's name. Claire Forcelia, the fourth princess, has finally arrived. Aki remembered the name from China's ally list, but Felina snapped it straight. He'd mixed up the fourth with the third. Noelle Forcelia, a steady, level-headed woman from the moderate faction. The girl's voice shook as she begged, "Did the princess arrive as an enemy?" But nobody dared to label her as a direct threat. This girl was a locked riddle. Nobody could ever figure her out. The princess calmly sipped her tea, her expression so utterly indifferent it felt like nothing could ever shake her. Trying to bury her excitement, the girl forced a polite smile and asked why they'd crashed by so suddenly. The hostess blurted an apology for the lack of a grand welcome, but the princess only answered in a calm, quiet voice she'd arrived without warning. The princess called him Aki Ginas, then snapped her own words back right on the spot, declaring he was only Aki now. And then she made it brutally clear, technically, she hadn't visited Lady Felina at all. She let him talk without all the formal fuss, but the boy kept his manners anyway, then couldn't stop himself from wondering whether she even knew what was going on at the Hina house. He was burning with questions. Were the royal family actually keeping the whole mess under total control? In her eyes, intricate runes spiraled to life, locking in her power the moment she needed it. A tiny, barely there smile flickered across the princess's lips. Aki's worry hit her hard, but she didn't stop. She kept talking anyway. It was a mystical eye, an insane power that let her right eye spill the true essence of everything it caught. They called it the glass eye, like some impossible power you could actually feel staring back. One look was all it took. She instantly caught the whole story in her eyes. She leaned in with a teasing smile, calling the gift boldly impudent, and the boy jolted back with a sharp flinch. A weird surge ripped through the boy's body. Claire's mana seeped in like a storm. At this point, hiding the truth from her didn't even make sense anymore. Felina roared with laughter at him for ages, then told him flat out to keep a poker face and never wear his feelings like an open book. A voice thundered from outside the chamber door, yelling that it was urgent to talk and that the elves had to be brought here, right now. The room crackled with tension, while the princess sipped her tea like nothing was wrong. Aki sat on the edge of his seat, barely able to breathe, waiting to see what she'd say. Rin snapped her eye open in an instant and froze, stunned to the bone. On the table, a stacked, multi-tiered dessert stand towered with sweet treats, and the little one's eyes snapped to it the moment it came into view. As the princess gracefully held up the cup, the other side of the table exploded in wild cries, demanding sweets right now. Aki gritted his teeth and wrestled the little troublemaker back, snapping that those treats were only for the royal person. But the princess just beamed softly, grabbed a pastry, and asked, calm at last, "Or are we still going to explode?" She told everyone to finally breathe, then swore she'd lay out her real intentions without sugarcoating a single thing. To calm him down, the girl fed the little one a sweet treat herself, and just like that, he shut up instantly. Still, the elf women didn't drop their guard. They grilled Aki, eyeing him hard, and demanded to know what he really stood to gain from all this. The princess hit him with the truth. Even without any straight claim to the throne, she still carried royal blood, and the boy couldn't stop thinking if he could really want anything at all. With a small, knowing smile, she leaned in and asked if he had some secret wish hiding in his heart. She locked eyes with him, then promised, straight to his face, that she'd grant any reasonable request he threw at her. Aki remembered Felina's warning about nobles who swallow simpletons whole, but the princess only smiled. No need to fear her, and, yeah, his advisor really was sharp. Aki stood there, stunned, because it finally hit him. This girl could read every thought in his head, like nothing was hidden. She cut straight through the pointless questions and admitted she only wanted to test his real intentions, especially when it came to the elves. The elf girl froze in shock, but the princess leaned in and soothed her. Because mana flows through us differently, elves' minds are sealed to me. As the elf girl snapped at the boy for his reckless carelessness in front of the telepath, he stayed calm and quietly wrestled with what he really wanted. She leaned in, staring straight into the depths of his eyes, and the moment she saw it, she couldn't believe it. He was telling pure, undeniable truth. The companions only sighed. Then the elf leaned in and swore there wasn't a shred of trickery in his heart, while the little one burst into laughter and called the boy a plain, ordinary simpleton. The princess fell quiet for a beat, like the whole world was holding its breath. With a mischievous little kiss against her lips, she smiled and declared she could finally trust him with her whole heart.